There exists a peculiar image in the archives of the Second World War, frozen in time like a photograph nobody quite expected to find. It shows a German artillery piece being drawn not by mechanical transport, not by the growl of an engine, but by a team of horses, their breath fogging in the Eastern European cold. And here we arrive at one of history's most counterintuitive puzzles. A nation that had pioneered mechanized warfare, that had built tanks and refined the blitzkrieg into a doctrine of devastating speed, that had imagined itself the architect of modern combat, was simultaneously fighting a war that depended on the muscle and endurance of hundreds of thousands of draft animals. By 1941, the Wehrmacht was operating across European landscapes, with more horses in its supply lines than Napoleon had commanded in his entire Grande Armée. How could this be? How could the most technologically ambitious military apparatus of its age wage its greatest campaigns on the backs of beasts that might have been more at home in the 19th century? The answer to that question winds through economics and geography, through logistics and desperation, through the gap between what a nation dreams of becoming and what it can actually afford. It is, in many ways, a story about the often invisible infrastructure that sustains warfare, the vast and grinding machinery of supply that few soldiers see but upon which all soldiers depend. The romanticized view of the Second World War tends to fix on armored columns and fighter squadrons, on the dramatic thrust of mechanization. But the true skeleton of any military operation is not found in those visible instruments of destruction. It lies in the unglamorous work of moving food, ammunition, fuel, and clothing across impossible distances, in the coordination of thousands of individual moving parts, in the decision to use what is available rather than what is ideal. If you have ever found yourself curious about how the smallest details of history often reveal the largest truths, how the presence of 1 million horses in a modern army speaks volumes about the hidden constraints and contradictions of its command, then perhaps you would consider subscribing to this channel. Each episode in this series draws you into the overlooked stories of warfare, the logistical realities and human dimensions that shape the course of nations. We explore not only what happened, but why it had to happen that way, given the world as it existed. Now, imagine the perspective of a German quartermaster in 1939, standing at the threshold of what was supposed to be a brief, decisive campaign against Poland. The mechanization dream seemed plausible then. Tanks would break through fortifications. Trucks would supply advancing armies. Speed would eliminate the need for the vast supply networks that had slowed previous wars. But Poland, while defeated in weeks, had offered a glimpse of something troubling. The roads were not what German planners had assumed. Infrastructure was poor. The distances, though traversable by motorized transport in good conditions, became nightmarish when vehicles broke down or fuel ran low. And here emerged the first of many uncomfortable realizations. Germany was not as mechanically abundant as it presented itself to be. The nation that would fight the world lacked the industrial capacity that such a war would demand. It did not possess, in the depths of the 1930s, the petroleum reserves necessary to fuel a mechanized army across the continent. It did not have the rubber for tires, the copper for wiring, the rare metals for engines, the manufacturing base to replace vehicles at the rate at which they would be destroyed. These were not idle concerns, not abstract problems for some future moment. They were immediate pressures, constraints that shaped every decision made in the planning rooms of Wehrmacht command. The choice to rely on horses was not a choice made from preference or tradition. It was, in the most literal sense, imposed by necessity. Consider what horses offered that vehicles could not, at least not given the circumstances in which Germany found itself. A horse could live off forage. It could consume local grass, hay, oats, and barley that could be gathered or requisitioned from the land through which an army moved. A mechanized vehicle, by contrast, required gasoline refined in refineries, transported by rail or truck, delivered to depots, and distributed to individual units. That supply chain was vulnerable at every link. It consumed resources. It required logistics. A horse was, in essence, a mobile storage container for food energy that could be converted locally. It was renewable in a way that petroleum was not, at least not on a timescale that mattered for military operations. Yet the irony ran deeper still. The very reliance on horses for local forage created a different kind of vulnerability. An army of horses, particularly one numbering in the hundreds of thousands, could strip a region of its agricultural resources with startling speed. This paradox, this tension between the promise of mechanical efficiency and the reality of available resources, would define the entire trajectory of the Wehrmacht's logistical struggle. It is a story that grows more complex and more poignant the further one looks into it, touching on questions of strategy, survival, and the strange ways that history's largest events are often shaped by its smallest details. As you settle into the narrative that unfolds from this moment forward, you will see how a question as simple as how to supply an army touches every aspect of a war's outcome, how the mathematics of beans and oats and petroleum ultimately matter far more than the romance of tanks and tactics might suggest. The paradox deepens when we consider what Germany actually inherited when Hitler came to power in 1933. The Reichswehr, as it was then called, was a military born from humiliation and constraint. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from maintaining an army larger than 100,000 men, and those soldiers were expected to fight with equipment that was, frankly, inadequate even by the standards of the early 1930s. There were no tanks to speak of, the Air Force barely existed, and the motorized transport network that would define modern warfare in the coming decade was simply absent from German military planning, not by choice, but by necessity. Germany had been forbidden from building such machines, and even if they hadn't been, the financial ruin of the Weimar years made such ambitions seem almost fantastical. Yet within months of taking power, Hitler began a secret rearmament program that would, over the course of the next 6 years, transform Germany into what appeared to be a modern military powerhouse. The speed of this transformation was stunning, almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. New factories rose from the earth. Tank designs were dusted off from filing cabinets and sent into production. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines in numbers that seemed to defy economic logic. And all of this happened while the rest of the world watched with a mixture of anxiety and disbelief. But here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, where the seeming miracle begins to reveal its fundamental contradiction. Germany's rearmament program, for all its visible speed and apparent modernization, was built on a foundation that was far more fragile than it appeared. The nation did not have the raw materials to sustain a long war. It did not have sufficient oil reserves. Its agricultural output could not feed both a massive military and a civilian population without rationing that would breed discontent. And perhaps most critically, Germany's industrial base, while impressive in its growth trajectory, was fundamentally constrained by a shortage of foreign currency with which to purchase the resources it desperately needed. This is the moment where we must introduce a figure whose influence on the entire trajectory of German military planning cannot be overstated: General Ludwig Beck. Beck was the chief of the General Staff during the early rearmament years, and he was, in many ways, the keeper of an older military tradition. A man who understood the relationship between logistics and warfare in a way that transcended mere theory. Beck knew, with a certainty that bordered on prophecy, that Germany could not sustain a prolonged conflict against the combined industrial might of Britain, France, and potentially the Soviet Union. He saw the numbers. He understood what they meant. And in 1935 he began warning, quietly but persistently, that any war lasting longer than 2 years would result in Germany's economic collapse. The men around Hitler listened to these warnings with varying degrees of attention. Some dismissed them as the pessimism of an older generation, out of touch with the dynamism of the new regime. Others took them seriously but believed that such a conflict would be brief, decided in weeks or months by the sheer military brilliance of German leadership and the supposed racial superiority of German fighting men. But Beck's warnings were not born of timidity or a lack of imagination. They were rooted in mathematics. They were rooted in the actual physical constraints of running a nation at war. It is perhaps useful to pause here and ask, what does an army actually need to function? At the most basic level, it needs to move. Its soldiers must be transported from one place to another. Its ammunition must be delivered to the front. Its fuel must reach its engines. Its food must be distributed to hungry men. The entire apparatus of warfare, for all the glory and ideology that surrounds it, is fundamentally a problem of logistics. It is a problem of moving sufficient quantities of material over sufficient distances in sufficient time to achieve military objectives. Every war in history, before and since, has been won and lost, not always by the side with the most courageous soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the side that could most efficiently solve this equation. How do we move what we need, where we need it, when we need it? Germany, in the late 1930s, faced this equation with a level of difficulty that its leadership seemed only partially to comprehend. The nation was not an island. It could not easily replace lost industrial capacity through capture or purchase. Its neighbors were increasingly hostile, or at least suspicious, and yet, the decision had been made. Germany would rearm. Germany would prepare for war. Germany would do so with the resources it had and with the ingenuity of its people. This is where the horse enters the story, not as a romantic relic of a bygone era, but as a practical solution to a desperate problem. It is where the modern collides with the ancient, in a way that few military historians truly anticipated, and fewer still were willing to publicly acknowledge. For as Germany built its tanks and its aircraft, as it trained its panzer divisions and its Luftwaffe pilots, it was simultaneously doing something that seemed almost laughably backward. It was training, breeding, and organizing the largest cavalry force that Europe would see in the 20th century. The gap between what Germany needed and what it could actually produce would only widen as the war pressed deeper into Europe. And this is where the peculiar marriage of modern machinery and ancient logistics becomes visible. The Wehrmacht was not, as popular imagination might suggest, some gleaming mechanized force rolling across the continent on tanks and motorcycles. Rather, it was a vast hybrid machine, part industrial marvel, part agricultural relic, held together by millions of horses, hundreds of thousands of supply wagons, and the desperate ingenuity of overextended quartermasters. By the time Germany invaded France in the spring of 1940, the Wehrmacht had already learned some harsh lessons from its Polish campaign. The distances involved were vast. The roads, in many regions, were appalling, and the appetite of modern warfare for ammunition, fuel, spare parts, food, and more ammunition still was almost insatiable. The success at the front always appeared to outpace the supply line's ability to sustain it. Generals grew frustrated. They pushed further, and supply officers, increasingly burdened, found themselves reaching for the one solution that had worked for centuries: the horse. Consider, for a moment, the arithmetic of mechanization. A motorized truck consumed petrol. That petrol had to be refined, transported across vast distances, stored in depots, and then distributed forward. Trucks broke down. They required spare parts and trained mechanics. They performed poorly in mud and snow. And critically, Germany simply did not have enough of them. The nation's petroleum reserves were limited. Importing oil meant dependence on Romania, and later on, whatever could be squeezed from conquered territories. But a horse ate grain and grass. It could be fed from local sources. It required minimal spare parts. And it could navigate terrain that would bog down a truck. And the one thing Germany had in abundance, or could obtain relatively easily, was land, vast stretches of it, across which horses could forage. The logic was almost fatalistic. The Wehrmacht had inherited a cavalry tradition stretching back centuries. Many of its senior officers came from aristocratic families with deep roots in that heritage. But this wasn't merely nostalgia or romantic attachment. It was pragmatism born from scarcity. As the war deepened and Germany's resource situation deteriorated, the reliance on horses didn't decrease. It intensified. And the scale of that reliance was staggering. What's particularly fascinating is how this compromise, this decision to fight a mechanized war with an agricultural logistics base, revealed itself in the army's actual structure and operations. The Wehrmacht never truly abandoned its horse units. Instead, it expanded them alongside its mechanized forces. By some estimates, at the height of German military strength in 1942 and 1943, the Wehrmacht was using nearly 750,000 horses. Some historians suggest the number may have been even higher. Think of that figure for a moment. 750,000 horses, all requiring food, water, veterinary care, and handlers. These weren't cavalry units in the traditional sense, at least not primarily. They were logistics animals. They pulled supply wagons, ammunition caissons, and kitchen wagons. They served as mobile transport across hundreds of miles of territory. This creates an almost paradoxical image of Nazi Germany, a regime celebrated for its technological ambition, its engineering prowess, its dreams of mechanized warfare, yet operationally dependent on an animal that had been central to warfare since the medieval period. The modern and the ancient were not, in fact, locked in a competition where one replaced the other. Instead, they coexisted, often uneasily, and the Wehrmacht supply system became a vast, contradictory machine. Diesel engines and horse-drawn carts, railway lines and country roads, petrol depots and grazing fields. The Russians understood this weakness, or at least they came to understand it. German armies, for all their offensive power, moved at the pace of their supply trains, and those supply trains, increasingly, were dependent on horses. The longer a German offensive pushed, the thinner the supply line became, the more vulnerable it grew. A sustained campaign required not just the capture of territory, but the establishment of reliable supply routes. And those routes, across the vast distances of the Soviet Union, were maintained by horses and drivers and quartermasters working in obscurity, while the panzer divisions received the glory. By the time the Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, this hybrid logistics system would be tested as never before, and it would begin to reveal its fundamental limitations. The distances were beyond anything Germany had previously attempted. The Soviet Union was vast. The roads were primitive. The climate, particularly as the seasons turned toward winter, was utterly savage. And the horse, despite its advantages, was also a creature of limits. It required food. It couldn't march forever. It could be wounded by enemy action. It could freeze in sub-zero temperatures. It could sicken and die en masse if conditions deteriorated. The decision to rely on horses wasn't made in a moment of clarity or strategic brilliance. It was made incrementally, by necessity, by budgetary constraints, by the hard arithmetic of petroleum shortages, by the simple fact that there weren't enough trucks, enough fuel, enough roads that could bear modern traffic. And once the decision had been made, or rather, once it had been made implicitly through the accumulation of smaller choices, It became embedded in the structure of the Wehrmacht itself. Entire supply companies were organized around horse-drawn transport. Breeding programs were established to maintain and expand the stock. Veterinary corps were expanded, and as the war deepened and became more desperate, the army's dependence on this ancient logistics system only grew. The mathematics of feeding an army, it turns out, are far more complicated than the mathematics of destroying one. A rifle can be manufactured in days. A supply line takes months to build, and once built, it is fragile in ways that are difficult to truly appreciate from the comfort of distance. When the Wehrmacht began its expansion across Europe in the late 1930s, the German General Staff possessed an almost encyclopedic understanding of mechanization. They had studied the future and believed they had chosen the winning side of history. Tanks, trucks, motorcycles, armored cars, these were the sinews of modern warfare. And yet, beneath this gleaming layer of mechanized ambition lay a reality far more pastoral, far more dependent on the rhythms of agriculture and animal husbandry than the party propaganda ever cared to acknowledge. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Wehrmacht had already begun to rely on horses in ways that would only deepen throughout the war. This was not, as some have suggested, a failure of foresight or a sign of backwardness. Rather, it was a logical choice born from specific constraints. Germany itself was not a particularly industrialized nation when compared to the Soviet Union or the United States in terms of raw manufacturing capacity. It was efficient, yes, extraordinarily so in certain sectors, but it lacked the mineral wealth, the oil reserves, and the sheer industrial footprint necessary to sustain a fully mechanized army of its size. Building trucks required materials, running trucks required fuel, and fuel, above all else, was the scarce resource that would haunt German planning until the very end. Consider the mathematics of substitution that the Wehrmacht's logisticians had to contemplate. A horse could eat grain grown in occupied territories. Grain was produced by peasant farmers in Poland, in France, in the Ukraine, regions that would fall under German control. A truck, by contrast, required refined petroleum products. These had to come either from domestic synthetic fuel plants, from captured reserves in Romania, or from conquered territories that happened to possess oil fields. The latter category was disappointingly small. This calculus, when spread across millions of soldiers and thousands of miles of front line, began to tilt the scales toward the animal that had served armies for thousands of years. The logistical planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, reveals this truth with particular clarity. German planners knew they would be fighting on an unprecedented scale, across distances that dwarfed any previous campaign. The Soviet Union stretched for thousands of kilometers. Supply lines would have to be extended across conquered territory, through regions that possessed minimal infrastructure and little in the way of existing roads. The railways that did exist were built to a different gauge than German standard equipment, a deliberate choice by the Soviets to impede any potential invader, which suggests they understood something about logistics that the Wehrmacht's optimists perhaps had not fully absorbed. In this environment of vast distance and infrastructure scarcity, what role could a truck realistically play? The answer, increasingly, was a limited one. Trucks could form the backbone of supply for the frontmost units, for the mechanized spearhead that would drive deep into Soviet territory. But behind that spearhead, stretching backward across hundreds of kilometers, the supply line would have to rely on something more resilient, something that could survive on local forage and required no refined fuel or spare parts manufactured in distant German factories. The horse became, in essence, the default solution, and so the Wehrmacht acquired millions of them. How many horses exactly did the German army use during the Second World War? The figure that emerges from historical research is staggering. By some estimates, the Wehrmacht would eventually employ more than 750,000 horses at any given moment during peak operations. Some sources suggest the total number of horses used throughout the entire war reached as high as 2.7 million, when accounting for replacements, attrition, and the constant churn of a massive military machine. To put this in perspective, this was roughly comparable to the entire number of trucks the Wehrmacht possessed over the same period. The image of a mechanized, steel-clad Nazi war machine is not entirely false, but it is certainly incomplete. For every panzer driving across the steppes, there were dozens of horse-drawn wagons following behind, carrying ammunition, food, and fuel. The sources for these horses came from multiple directions. Some were purchased or requisitioned from German farms and Eastern European breeders. Horses had always been important to European agriculture, and nations like Poland and Hungary possessed significant equine populations. The Wehrmacht simply bought or commandeered them. This too was part of the cost of occupation and conquest. The animals that farmers depended on were pressed into military service, leaving civilian agriculture depleted and populations undernourished. But beyond simple requisition, Germany also captured hundreds of thousands of Russian horses during the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army itself relied heavily on cavalry and mounted transport, particularly in its early phases. When German forces encircled Soviet units, they sometimes captured not just soldiers, but entire supply trains with their horses intact. These animals were quickly integrated into Wehrmacht service, though their ability to adapt to different feeding conditions and handling methods varied considerably. The effort required to maintain such a vast equine population was itself a massive undertaking, one that is sometimes overlooked in discussions of Wehrmacht logistics. Horses require care. They need farriers to maintain their hooves, veterinarians to treat disease and wounds, adequate fodder and water, and handlers who understand animal behavior. The Wehrmacht established an entire apparatus to manage this responsibility. There were veterinary units assigned to different corps and divisions. There were hay depots and grain stores strategically located throughout occupied territories. There were purchasing commissions that traveled through Eastern Europe, hunting for additional animals to replace those lost to combat, disease, or exhaustion. All of this infrastructure, while less visible and less photogenic than a lineup of panzers, was nonetheless integral to the functioning of the German army. And here emerges a curious paradox that becomes visible only when we step back from the familiar dramatic narratives. The Wehrmacht, an army built on the ideology of racial superiority and technological modernity, found itself sustained in critical ways by the most ancient forms of supply line. The horse did not care about Nazi ideology. The horse did not know it was supposedly part of a 1,000-year empire. The horse simply pulled wagons, ate grain, and died when subjected to the same grinding pressures as everything else on the Eastern Front. Yet for millions of German soldiers, for years, the horse was the true foundation of their ability to fight. The tank might have captured the imagination and the propaganda materials, but it was the horse that brought the ammunition to the tank, that delivered the food to the crew, that carried the wounded to the rear. Without the horse, the panzer was merely a monument to aspiration. The mathematics of that impossible equation, feeding millions, moving supplies across a continent, keeping an army not just fed but armed and ready, began to reveal itself in the decisions made in the years before the war itself had even truly begun. You see, the German High Command wasn't blind to the realities of their own resources. They understood, with a clarity born of bitter history and careful analysis, that the nation they led would never possess the mineral wealth, the oil reserves, the agricultural abundance of the vast territories to their east. And so they planned for something that modern military theorists had begun to regard as almost quaint. They planned to make war live off the land. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though cruelty would certainly follow. This was desperation, dressed in the uniform of strategic doctrine. If you cannot manufacture enough of what you need, you must take it from where you conquer. If you cannot build enough trucks, you must move supplies with what your conquered territories already possess. In the case of Eastern Europe and Russia, what they possessed in abundance were horses, millions and millions of them, creatures that had pulled plows across those vast steppes for centuries, that had been bred and raised and maintained in a way that had persisted almost unchanged since the Napoleonic Wars. Here was a resource that didn't require oil, didn't require rubber from distant colonies, didn't require the complex industrial infrastructure that lay at the heart of modern mechanized warfare. The planning documents from the German General Staff in the late 1930s reveal something almost melancholic in their thoroughness. They calculated not just how many horses would be needed, but how those horses would be fed in regions where the soil itself was thin and the growing season short. They estimated forage requirements, mapped potential grazing lands, considered the logistics of maintaining veterinary services for literally hundreds of thousands of animals spread across thousands of miles of front line. It was, in a strange way, a return to an older kind of warfare, conducted with modern desperation and applied with industrial precision. The contradiction wasn't lost on anyone paying close attention, but it was accepted as inevitable. What choice did they have? By the time the invasion of Poland began in September of 1939, the Wehrmacht had already incorporated something like 300,000 horses into its supply and transport operations. 300,000, a number almost too vast to comprehend without context. Consider that this was roughly equivalent to the entire animal transport capacity that had existed during the First World War, drawn up again from the resources of nations that had only recently emerged from that conflict. The horses came from Germany itself, from Poland and Czechoslovakia once those nations fell, from Romania and Hungary through trade agreements and requisitions. They came, increasingly, from France after the fall in 1940. The acquisition of horses became, in its way, a war aim in itself. What made this arrangement work, at least in its early stages, was a kind of grim efficiency born from centuries of European cavalry tradition. The German army still maintained cavalry units, not anymore for the charge or the reconnaissance of open ground, but for the management of transport animals. Officers trained in the traditional arts of horsemanship found themselves presiding over vast herds of working animals, each one a node in a network that stretched from the factory floors of the Ruhr to the frozen steppe outside Moscow. The horses themselves, it might be noted, possessed certain advantages in this landscape that no truck could match. They could forage for themselves when supplies ran low. They could navigate terrain that wheeled vehicles could not. In mud, in snow, in the kind of conditions that rendered even the legendary German engineering temporarily useless, the horse remained reliable. The horse remained faithful to its own biology and indifference. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about this reality, something that even contemporary observers noticed and recorded. Here was one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth, a nation that had embraced mechanization as a solution to all problems, still fundamentally dependent on the ancient partnership between human and animal for the movement of war. The photographs from the Russian front show endless lines of horse-drawn wagons stretching across snow-covered roads, the animals steaming in the bitter cold, their handlers wrapped in whatever cloth could be found. The visual contradiction, artillery pieces that had been manufactured in the previous decade being pulled not by truck, but by horse and harness, became almost iconic of the strange paradox at the heart of the German war machine. The maintenance of this system required its own kind of infrastructure, and that infrastructure represented a drain on resources that modern analysis often overlooks. Farriers had to be trained and assigned throughout the occupied territories. Veterinary supplies had to be manufactured and distributed. Fodder had to be grown, harvested, stored, and transported, all while the land itself was being drained to feed the human combatants. When winter came to Russia in 1941 and 1942, the horses began to die in numbers that staggered even hardened officers. The cold alone killed them. The lack of adequate shelter killed them. The impossible demands of maintaining an army in conditions that no creature accustomed to European climates had ever been expected to endure killed them by the thousands. How many horses died on the Russian front during the entire war? The question is almost impossible to answer with precision, though historians have suggested figures that range into the millions. Some estimates place the number at well over 2 million animals lost during the campaign in the East alone. 2 million, each one representing not just the loss of transport capacity, but a small death that contributed to the larger catastrophe unfolding across that frozen landscape. And for each horse that died, new ones had to be found, acquired, trained, and integrated into the system. The machinery of supply continued to depend on the biological reality of these creatures, utterly indifferent to the strategic calculations of their commanders. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant in practical terms. The dependence on horses wasn't some minor logistical footnote. The Wehrmacht's entire Eastern campaign, the operation that was meant to break Soviet power within a matter of months, was fundamentally constrained by the carrying capacity of animals that could march perhaps 20 kilometers a day when conditions were favorable. When conditions were not favorable, and on the Russian steppe, conditions were rarely favorable, that distance shrank dramatically. A modern truck convoy could theoretically move supplies at speeds that multiplied the effective range of an army. Horses moved at the speed of hooves and breath and biological necessity. The war that Hitler had envisioned as being won by speed and technological superiority thus became, in its most fundamental infrastructure, dependent on the pace of a creature that had pulled wagons during the reign of Frederick the Great. The reality of those supply calculations, though, was far grimmer than any diagram could capture. Because when you actually traced a single Wehrmacht soldier's journey from Berlin eastward into Soviet territory, what emerged was not a picture of logistical precision, but rather one of compounding desperation, layer upon layer. The distances involved were almost incomprehensible to a modern mind accustomed to trucks and trains and flight. From the German border to Moscow is roughly 2,000 kilometers, but that figure, that clean, abstract number, conceals the true ordeal. It wasn't simply distance. It was distance measured across primitive roads that turned to mud the moment autumn rains began, across a landscape deliberately scorched by the retreating Soviets, through territories where the local population offered no supply base, no established infrastructure to tap into, no friendly towns where requisitions could be made. Consider the life of a Wehrmacht supply truck driver in the summer of 1941, as Operation Barbarossa was unfolding in its opening weeks. He might begin his day in a makeshift depot perhaps 500 kilometers behind the front lines. His truck, likely a captured French or Czech vehicle, or perhaps a standard German Opel Blitz, was loaded with ammunition, canned food, spare parts, fuel in jerry cans. The journey ahead of him would take days. In daylight, he drove constantly, rationing fuel carefully because there was never enough. At night, he stopped in darkness, sleeping fitfully in or near his cab, alert always to partisan attack or mechanical failure. The road itself was barely a road. Summer of 1941 brought dust so thick that visibility reduced to a few meters, and drivers navigated almost blind, following tire tracks laid down by the convoys ahead. When the rains came, and they came with shocking ferocity in October and November, those same roads dissolved into something resembling chocolate mousse, meter-deep trenches of mud that swallowed trucks whole. Recovery of a mired vehicle required horses or other trucks to pull it free, which meant more fuel consumed, more time lost, fewer supplies reaching the front. The horses, though, they deserve their own quiet moment of consideration here, because they were not peripheral to the story, but central to it, woven through every layer of this catastrophe. By late 1941, the Wehrmacht had secured through requisition, capture, and purchase somewhere in the region of 3.5 million horses. These were not romantic cavalry chargers in the 19th century sense. They were work animals, sturdy draft horses, breeding stock of various quality, creatures mostly past their prime, many of them already showing signs of exhaustion by the time they entered German service. The logistics of feeding 3.5 million horses across the Russian winter was itself a logistical problem of staggering proportion. Each horse required roughly 25 kilograms of oats or hay per day. Do the mathematics. Multiply that by 3.5 million. Then multiply by 365 days. The tonnage is beyond intuitive grasp. It enters the realm of pure abstraction. And yet it was concrete, brutally so, because horses died. They died by the thousands in the first months, then by the tens of thousands through the winter. They died from cold, frostbite on their hooves, their breath freezing in their lungs, their muscles simply refusing to function in temperatures that dropped to -30, -40 Celsius. They died from starvation because the supplies meant to feed them never arrived or arrived too late. They died from disease, from overwork, from being asked to haul loads across frozen mud in conditions that no animal could reasonably endure. The irony, and it is an irony worth sitting with for a moment, is that these horses represented Germany's attempt to solve a problem that modern mechanization itself had created. Had the Wehrmacht operated on a smaller scale, had it not launched an invasion of such vast geographic scope, had it remained content with territorial gains in Poland and France, then perhaps horse transport would have been adequate. But the ambition of the enterprise meant that the Wehrmacht was forced back into the supply methods of a previous century precisely in order to support a modern war. Tanks required fuel, ammunition trucks required powerful engines. The infrastructure supporting these machines was fundamentally different from the infrastructure of the horse age. Yet the gaps in that infrastructure, the shortfalls, the breakdowns, the simple impossibility of building a supply line long enough and deep enough to serve millions of soldiers across thousands of kilometers, these gaps had to be filled by creatures that belonged to another era entirely. The question that historians have quietly posed, over and over, is this: did anyone in the German High Command fully understand what they were asking of their supply system, or were they engaged in a kind of collective self-deception? The generals certainly had reports, the quartermasters certainly filed calculations, but the distance between a report and a reality that unfolds day by day in mud and cold and human exhaustion is an enormous one. It is the distance between a map and a territory. A report might say that provisions will be distributed according to a certain timetable. The territory responds with mud. It responds with horses dying in tens of thousands. It responds with soldiers rationing food, then rationing again, then eating whatever scraps can be found, then stealing, then starving. There is a flattening that occurs when complexity becomes actual experience, and the supply crisis of the Russian front was such a crisis, not abstract, not theoretical, but lived in the bodies of men and animals who were pushed beyond their limits. As the autumn of 1941 deepened and the first winter began to close around the German armies, the illusion of a quick victory, which had sustained much of the planning, much of the confidence, started to crack in visible ways. Not everywhere at once, but in pockets, in supply depots, in messages filtering back to Berlin. The supplies that were meant to sustain the army through a summer and early autumn campaign were running critically low. Replacement stocks meant to arrive in October and November were delayed or diverted. The factories back in Germany, despite increases in production, could not manufacture enough ammunition, enough fuel, enough clothing, enough everything. And the horses? The horses died in the thousands, then tens of thousands. By the end of 1941, of the 3.5 million animals that had entered Soviet territory, something approaching 2 million were dead or permanently disabled. An entire supply ecosystem was collapsing in real time, and the men at the front, the soldiers who depended on that ecosystem for their survival, were beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, that this war would not be won in a single summer campaign. Something was shifting, something was breaking, and yet the war continued. The scale of this mechanical dependency became almost impossible to hide by the middle years of the war, particularly as the Wehrmacht began its retreat from the Eastern Front. Imagine standing in a vast supply depot in occupied Poland in 1943, surrounded by thousands of horses awaiting distribution to fighting divisions. The animals themselves were a casualty of logistics. Many had already endured months of inadequate fodder, had limped across hundreds of kilometers of frozen roads, and now stood tethered in rows, their breath clouding in the winter air. They represented not just transportation, but a kind of temporal paradox. Here was the most mechanized military of its age, armed with panzer tanks and Messerschmitt fighters, dependent upon creatures that had served armies since the Middle Ages. The reason for this dependency ran deeper than simple mismanagement or romantic devotion to cavalry traditions, though both played a role. It was fundamentally rooted in Germany's foreign exchange crisis and its inability to sustain the fuel demands of a fully motorized army across the vast territories it had conquered. Petroleum was the lifeblood that Germany lacked. The Wehrmacht consumed approximately 1 million tons of fuel annually by 1941, and this figure only grew as the war expanded. Romania provided some oil, Hungary provided some, synthetic production in the industrial heartland of Germany provided more, but none of these sources were sufficient to power every truck, every jeep, every transport vehicle across the endless steppes of Russia. Consider the arithmetic of it, almost meditative in its cold mathematics. A single German motor transport division, the kind responsible for supplying frontline troops with ammunition, food, and replacement parts, could include between 1,500 and 2,000 vehicles. One of these vehicles might consume anywhere from 20 to 30 liters of fuel per day, depending on how heavily laden it was and what kind of terrain it crossed. A division might require, conservatively, 30,000 liters of fuel daily just to move supplies from depots to core-level distribution points. Now multiply that across an army of millions stretched across thousands of kilometers. The numbers become almost unimaginable, and they grow more unimaginable the further from Germany's borders those armies advance. A supply truck traveling from Warsaw to the front near Moscow faced a journey of over 1,500 kilometers, consuming fuel along nearly every kilometer of that route. The horse, by contrast, required no fuel in the modern sense. It required hay and oats and fresh water, resources that could often be requisitioned from occupied territories, particularly Eastern Europe, where enormous agricultural estates could be converted rapidly to military use. The carrying capacity of a horse was modest, perhaps 200 kilograms of supplies, but a horse could travel perhaps 40 to 50 kilometers in a day over rough terrain, and it could sustain this pace for weeks with proper supply and care. More importantly, the psychological burden of the horse on the supply chain was immeasurably lighter than that of a truck. A horse broken down on the road could be repaired by a blacksmith with a forge. A truck required spare parts manufactured in German factories and shipped forward through the very logistics chains that were already strained beyond their limits. By 1942, As the war deepened and the conquest of Russia proved far more protracted than any German planner had envisioned, this calculus had already begun to reshape the Wehrmacht's supply doctrine. The High Command, particularly the Quartermaster General's office, confronted a troubling reality. The army would need to rationalize its motor pool, to concentrate fuel where it was most tactically essential, with combat units, with mechanized divisions, with Panzer Corps, and to delegate supply transport in other sectors to whatever alternatives remained available. And what alternatives did the Wehrmacht possess? In Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Ukraine, in the conquered Western Soviet territories, there remained millions of horses, most of them privately or communally owned, most of them ripe for requisition under occupation law. The requisition process itself became a grim administrative machine. German occupation authorities in each district received quotas for horse procurement. Local populations were ordered to surrender riding horses, draft horses, any animals suitable for transport. In Poland alone, estimates suggest that between 1 and 2 million horses were taken from the civilian population during the course of the occupation, funneled into Wehrmacht supply units at depots like the one we imagined in Warsaw. Some of these animals came from cavalry units of conquered nations. Poland's own cavalry, for instance, had been defeated and largely dismounted by 1940, leaving its horses available for German seizure. But the vast majority came from civilian sources, removed from farms and estates by force, separated from owners who depended upon them for their own survival. The integration of these seized animals into Wehrmacht logistics created what might be called a second supply chain, running parallel to the motor transport system. This equine supply system was less visible in the official records, less celebrated in military histories, but it was no less real in its effects on the war's conduct. A typical German army on the Eastern Front might field between 75,000 and 150,000 horses at any given time, depending on its size and its distance from German territory. Compared to its motor pool, this seemed almost quaint, almost secondary, yet the horses carried nearly as much tonnage as the trucks in certain theaters and in certain phases of the war. Supply officers calculated that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all supplies reaching frontline divisions traveled the final kilometers on horseback, particularly during winter when vehicles became unreliable and mud. The infamous Rasputitsa transformed roads into near-impassable quagmires. The physical reality of maintaining this horse logistics system was profoundly different from managing motor transport. Horses required veterinary care, farriery, feed procurement, and rotation to prevent collapse. The Wehrmacht eventually established specialized veterinary companies, horse hospitals, and remount stations to manage the health of its equine supply chain. Yet these facilities were often inadequate, stretched thin across enormous territories, and subordinate in priority to repair facilities for vehicles and weapons. Horses died by the hundreds of thousands, from disease, from exposure, from exhaustion, from inadequate forage. The records suggest that between 1941 and 1945, the Wehrmacht lost approximately 3 million horses, either to these causes or to enemy action. Many of these animals had been requisitioned from occupied territories, from families who depended upon them for their own subsistence, and their death represented not just a military loss, but a compounding human tragedy in territories that were already experiencing terror and starvation. Yet from a purely logistical perspective, the system persisted because it worked, or at least, it worked better than any alternative the Wehrmacht possessed. The choice was not between horses and some imagined ideal of total motorization. That option had never been available to Germany. The choice was between horses and a complete collapse of supply lines to forward divisions. And as the war continued, as Germany's industrial capacity became increasingly devoted to weapons production, and to compensating for combat losses rather than to manufacturing new vehicles, the horse became not a transitional resource, but a permanent and essential component of the Wehrmacht's supply apparatus. By 1944, as Germany's fuel situation had become genuinely critical, horses were perhaps more important to the army's functioning than they had been at any earlier point in the war. The irony was profound and terrible. The nation that had pioneered the Blitzkrieg, that had created a new form of warfare built upon rapid mechanized movement, found itself increasingly dependent upon the oldest form of transport available to the modern world. By the middle years of the war, the true shape of the Wehrmacht's logistical crisis had become impossible to deny, even as German commanders continued to deploy their forces with undiminished confidence across the sprawling territories they occupied. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 had fundamentally altered the entire equation of supply, pushing the German army farther from its bases, farther from its factories, and into a landscape that was, quite simply, hostile to the kind of mechanized warfare that the Reich had been designed to wage. The distances alone were almost incomprehensible when placed against the experience of campaigning in France or the Balkans, where the drive to Paris had measured itself in weeks and in hundreds of kilometers. The push toward Moscow asked the Wehrmacht to cover thousands upon thousands of kilometers through terrain that grew progressively more difficult, more isolated, and more brutal as winter approached with the kind of inevitability that only the Russian continent seemed to possess. It was during these middle years that the horse became something far more than a convenient backup to mechanical transport. The horse became, in many ways, a necessity born of desperation, and yet curiously, a necessity that revealed certain truths about the nature of industrial warfare that perhaps the German High Command had not fully reckoned with. The Soviet Union, despite its vast resources, despite the enormous industrial capacity that Stalin had built through decades of brutal collectivization, was itself operating on principles of supply that would have seemed almost medieval to an observer from the industrialized West. Yet the Soviet system, precisely because it had emerged from a rural and agricultural base, had retained the capacity to sustain itself through methods that Germany, more thoroughly industrialized and more dependent on mechanical advantage, could not so easily replicate. The arithmetic of the Eastern Front became, quite literally, an arithmetic of consumption. Each division of the Wehrmacht required food, ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts for vehicles that were increasingly difficult to replace. The railroads that carried supplies eastward had to be constructed or rebuilt according to German specifications, because the Soviet rail gauge was deliberately different from the European standard, a fact that had not escaped German planners, but which nonetheless represented an enormous logistical burden. Every supply train that rolled eastward had to be converted or had to run on tracks that German engineers had laid down themselves, kilometer after kilometer, across a landscape that partisan forces would target with every weapon at their disposal. The mathematics began to suggest a question that grew more urgent with each passing month. At what point does the cost of extending your supply lines exceed the value of the territory that those supply lines are meant to defend? Consider the simple matter of fuel. The Wehrmacht's vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, tanks, staff cars, all depended upon a steady supply of refined gasoline and diesel, resources that Germany itself did not produce in sufficient abundance. The Reich had access to Romanian oil, to synthetic fuel plants that operated at considerable expense, and to whatever fuel could be captured from conquered territories. But as the front lines stretched across the vast plains of the Ukraine and toward the Caucasus, the consumption of fuel for transport alone, before a single shot was fired in anger, began to consume an ever larger proportion of the total fuel supply available to the Wehrmacht. There existed, in other words, a point of diminishing return, a point at which the fuel required to carry supplies forward exceeded the fuel that those supplies contained, a curious and paradoxical situation that haunted German planning from the moment the invasion began. The solution that emerged, almost organically, was to revert to a form of logistics that had been employed by armies for centuries: the horse, the ox, the mule. These animals did not require refined fuel. They could be fed on the crops and forage available in the territories through which they moved. In a sense, they represented a form of energy conversion that was extraordinarily efficient within the context of the Soviet landscape. Grain grown in the Ukraine could be harvested and fed to horses. The horses could then carry supplies forward. The efficiency was not perfect. Nothing in war ever is, but it was real, and it was sustainable in a way that depending entirely on automotive transport could not be. By 1942, the German army had become what we might call a partially motorized force. It was motorized where it absolutely had to be, where tactical advantage demanded the speed and firepower that vehicles provided. The panzer divisions, the elite of the Wehrmacht, remained thoroughly mechanized. The panzer grenadier units retained their trucks and half-tracks. But the infantry divisions that formed the true backbone of the army, the soldiers who walked and fought and occupied territory, increasingly relied on horse-drawn logistics. The horses did not belong to specialized cavalry units, though cavalry still existed and still played a role in reconnaissance and in the mobile operations that the Eastern Front demanded. Rather, the horses were integrated into the supply apparatus of each division, part of the vast machinery of transport that allowed those divisions to function, to move, to fight. The procurement of these animals became itself a logistical challenge of astonishing complexity. Where were horses to be found? The Wehrmacht had its own breeding programs, but these could not produce animals quickly enough to replace casualties. Instead, horses were requisitioned from conquered territories. Polish horses, French horses, Russian horses, animals that had been seized from civilian populations, from state farms, from anywhere that the German occupation forces could locate them. A division might contain anywhere from 500 to 2,000 horses, depending on its configuration and its mission. The army as a whole, at its peak strength on the Eastern Front, was using more than 300,000 horses, a figure so enormous that it becomes almost abstract. Imagine, if you will, a logistics network so vast that it required the care and feeding and replacement of more horses than existed in most European nations. The care of these animals fell to soldiers who were, in many cases, trained farriers, veterinarians, and horse handlers, men whose skills would have seemed antiquated in an age of mechanical transport, yet whose expertise became invaluable in the depths of the Russian winter. These men had to ensure that horses were shod properly, that they received adequate food and water, that they were treated for diseases and injuries. The mortality rate among horses was substantial, particularly in winter, when the cold could kill an animal as efficiently as enemy fire. Frozen feed, frozen water. The simple inability of the animal to maintain body heat in temperatures that dropped far below what any domesticated horse had been bred to endure. These were killers that no amount of care could entirely prevent. And yet the horse persisted, pulling supply wagons across frozen steppes, carrying ammunition through forests, serving as a silent counterpoint to the technological prowess that the Wehrmacht displayed in its tanks and in its aircraft. What does it suggest, one might wonder, that an army so thoroughly committed to mechanization, to the technologies of the 20th century, found itself unable to wage its greatest war without reverting to the technologies of an earlier age? Perhaps it suggests something about the relationship between technology and logistics, about the difference between the capacity to build a superior weapon and the capacity to sustain an army in the field. Perhaps it suggests something about the dangers of overextension, of reaching beyond the supply lines that can reasonably sustain an operation, Or perhaps it simply reveals a truth that military theorists have long understood, that the logistical tale, though unglamorous, is finally more important than the tactical head. The true weight of this logistical crisis became visible not in the command bunkers of Berlin or the general staff offices, but in the mud and snow where horses sank to their bellies and men learned that mechanized warfare could fracture under the strain of distance and cold. By the winter of 1941, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the supply lines had stretched so thin that entire divisions were consuming their own horse herds just to survive. Consider the mathematics of it. A single German division required roughly 750 tons of supplies per day. A truck convoy moving through winter conditions might cover only 30 or 40 kilometers. And yet, the vast spaces of the Soviet Union demanded movement across hundreds of kilometers. The horse, for all its limitations, could move across ground that trucks could not, through snow and through the terrible thaw when roads became impassable streams of mud. This was not romanticism or tradition. This was arithmetic. This was the cold calculation of a logistics officer staring at a map and realizing that his supply depots were unreachable by any mechanical means. What happened in those early months of the Russian campaign was something that few historians have emphasized with sufficient clarity. Germany did not maintain a horse army because of nostalgia or military incompetence, but because the reality of warfare across continental distances had not yet changed as much as the machines themselves suggested it should have. The German army had, through the 1930s, developed one of the world's most advanced tank corps. Yet they had also done something that seemed contradictory. They had standardized horse equipment. They had created detailed veterinary manuals. They had established breeding programs. Why would a modern state do such a thing? The answer lies in a deeper truth about warfare itself, that the transition from animal to mechanical power was not a switch that flipped in 1940 or even 1945, but a long, uneven process that different nations navigated at different speeds, and in which many found themselves trapped between two worlds. Germany's first motorization drive had begun in the late 1920s, and by 1935, the General Staff had set ambitious targets. The goal was to motorize perhaps half the Wehrmacht's transport capacity within a decade. This was expensive, this was ambitious. And then something happened that complicated everything. The economic isolation that came with the Nazi regime's rearmament policies and its racial ideology. Germany could not simply purchase oil and rubber from the world market as freely as other nations. There were sanctions, there were boycotts, there were shortages. The synthetic fuel program, the Leona plants, the hydrogenation process. These were attempts to create the raw materials for a modern war without dependence on imports. But they were also expensive, they were energy-intensive, and they were never quite sufficient. What emerged was not a choice between horses and trucks, but a compromise. Germany would have both. They would mechanize where they could, and they would maintain what they had. This was not defeat, this was adaptation. By 1939, the German army possessed something like 2,500 trucks. By 1941, that number had risen, but not nearly to the level that the invasion of the Soviet Union would require. The Blitzkrieg concept itself had been built around the idea that wars would be short, that supplies would be captured from the enemy, that the enemy would be defeated before logistical constraints became binding. This assumption had worked, barely, in Poland and France. The distances were manageable. The campaigns were brief, but the Soviet Union was not Poland. It was not France. It was an abyss of space, and into that abyss, the Wehrmacht poured men and machines and horses, learning only gradually that it had not brought enough of any of them. The horses themselves tell a story worth dwelling on. The Wehrmacht's horses came from all over Europe. They came from Poland, from Hungary, from France, from the occupied territories. They came also from Germany itself. They came in a steady stream from the breeding stations and the cavalry depots, and they arrived on the Russian front with no real understanding of what awaited them. A horse accustomed to the moderate climates of Western Europe was suddenly exposed to temperatures that fell to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. The fodder that had sustained them in France, oats, hay, carefully measured rations, was now replaced by whatever could be found locally, which was often nothing. Soviet horses, bred for those conditions, might have survived better. But the Wehrmacht was using horses from its conquered territories, and they were dying in numbers that multiplied catastrophically as winter deepened. In December 1941, German commanders were reporting that their horses were dropping dead faster than they could be replaced. Some estimates suggest that by the end of that first winter on the Russian front, the Wehrmacht had lost nearly 250,000 horses. 250,000. The number carries an almost incomprehensible weight. Each one of those animals represented a failure of logistics, a tear in the fabric of supply, a ton of carrying capacity simply vanishing into the snow. And yet, the German army kept requesting more horses. The supply depots kept sending them. Because the alternative was to admit that the entire campaign was impossible, and Germany could not afford to do that. What is perhaps most fascinating about this moment is how it reveals the gap between technological capability and practical reality. Germany had developed sophisticated tank designs, advanced artillery, rapid-fire weapons, and yet a significant portion of the Wehrmacht's military power was being transported by animals that needed food and water and shelter, animals that could not navigate around obstacles, animals that could be spooked or wounded or simply exhausted. The German General Staff understood this. They had studied it. They had written about it in their field manuals. But understanding a problem and solving it are not the same thing, and by 1942, Germany was no longer trying to solve it. They were simply trying to manage it, to keep the wheels turning, to keep supply flowing to the front, even though the wheels themselves were increasingly made of flesh and bone rather than rubber and steel. Is it possible that this contradiction, this strange mixture of the modern and the ancient, was not a weakness that Germany failed to overcome, but rather a revelation about what warfare actually required, even at the height of mechanized capability? Perhaps the answer is more unsettling than either explanation alone would suggest. The reality of Wehrmacht Supply became even more apparent when one examines the actual figures from the Russian campaign, those vast and almost incomprehensible numbers that stretch the modern mind to its limits. By the winter of 1941, as the German army pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the logistical strain had already begun to reshape the entire structure of the campaign itself. The distances involved were simply without precedent in modern warfare. Moscow lay over 1,000 kilometers from the German starting positions, and as supply lines stretched across conquered territory, the efficiency of movement declined in a pattern that was almost mathematical, almost inevitable. For every 100 kilometers of advance, the capacity to deliver ammunition, food, and fuel decreased noticeably, measurably, and the effects accumulated like snow gathering on a winter road. What made this particularly acute was the nature of Soviet rail networks, which the Wehrmacht had not anticipated with sufficient precision. The Russians, you see, had deliberately built their railways to a different gauge than those used in Western Europe, a choice made decades earlier that now, in this terrible context, became an act of unintentional military wisdom. When German engineers arrived to repair and utilize captured Soviet railways, they found themselves confronting an entirely incompatible system. The standard gauge was 5 feet, Russian gauge was just over 4 feet 8 inches. But the real obstacle was not merely the measurement, It was that converting the entire network from one system to another was a feat that required enormous resources, factories dedicated entirely to the purpose, and time that the German High Command did not possess. They had assumed swift victory. They had not prepared for conversion on this scale. This rail incompatibility meant that supplies arriving at German depots could not simply be loaded onto Soviet trains and distributed forward. Instead, goods had to be transshipped, unloaded from German gauge cars, reloaded onto different vehicles, or transported by truck across impossible distances. The inefficiency multiplied at each transfer point, and the human labor required was staggering. When one considers that Germany was already struggling to maintain domestic rail transport while simultaneously supplying a vast military apparatus across Europe, adding this additional layer of complexity created something approaching a logistics nightmare, and yet the Wehrmacht persisted, adapting, improvising, and in many cases, returning to the very solution that had seemed archaic before the war had even begun. The horse, in this context, represented not merely a romantic echo of cavalry tradition, but rather a deeply practical answer to a problem that modern machinery could not solve within the available resources. Think of it this way. A truck requires fuel, spare parts, mechanics, and regular maintenance. In the depths of Russia, in the frozen wastelands where temperatures plummeted to levels that made engine oil congeal and rubber brittle, trucks failed at alarming rates. A horse, by contrast, required only forage, and forage could be obtained from the land itself if one were willing to dispossess the local population, which the Wehrmacht certainly was. The moral dimensions of that choice deserve reflection, though we are tracing here the mechanics of logistics rather than the ethics. But they are intertwined, inseparable, and part of the same historical moment. By 1942, the Wehrmacht had acquired such vast numbers of horses that they had become not merely supplementary to mechanized transport, but genuinely foundational to the system. Documents from German Quartermaster Corps indicate that on any given day, the army required something in the region of 300,000 horses to function. And while the exact figure varied according to season, operational tempo, and the phase of the campaign, that number represents a staggering organizational achievement. To feed 300,000 animals, one must secure millions of tons of hay, oats, and other fodder annually. This fodder had to be grown, harvested, stored, and transported, and in occupied territories ravaged by war and German requisition policies, finding adequate supplies became progressively more difficult. Horses began to starve in the very territories where they were meant to sustain themselves through local foraging. The consequence was a grim arithmetic that played out across the vast landscape of Eastern Europe. As horses weakened from insufficient nutrition, their capacity to work declined, requiring yet more animals to be requisitioned to replace them. Cavalry divisions found themselves constantly requesting remounts, and the German military administration developed entire procurement networks dedicated simply to acquiring more and more horses. They scoured Hungary, Poland, the Balkans, any territory they controlled where horses could be gathered, and this persistent demand for animal replacements itself became a form of economic extraction and devastation in conquered lands. Local populations were often left with insufficient draft animals for their own agricultural purposes, which created famines and economic collapse in territories that Germany then had to administer and supply with food they did not possess. Here is where one begins to perceive the truly circular nature of the problem, the way that each attempted solution generated new difficulties that required further solutions. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horse transport to overcome rail limitations meant they required unprecedented numbers of animals. The acquisition of those animals strained the economies of occupied territories. The economic strain required German intervention and assistance. The provision of that assistance consumed resources that might have been directed to other military purposes. The strain on Germany's own economic capacity meant fewer mechanized vehicles could be produced. Fewer vehicles meant greater reliance on horse transport, and the cycle continued, self-reinforcing, inescapable. A historian might pause here to ask a question that often receives insufficient attention. Was there truly no alternative? Could the Wehrmacht have pursued different strategic choices that would have avoided this dependency? The answer, examined from the careful distance of historical analysis, is perhaps more complicated than either contemporary German commanders or modern observers might have preferred. The fundamental problem was that Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the fuel resources, and the economic system to fully mechanize a military operation of this scale across this vast geography. They made conscious choices, certainly, choices driven by ideology, by Hitler's personal preferences, by institutional military traditions, but those choices operated within severe constraints that were structural, almost built into the nature of German industrial capacity at that historical moment. To have avoided the horse would have required either smaller strategic objectives or dramatically different economic and industrial decisions made years before the war began. What emerges from this analysis is not a simple story of backward thinking or military incompetence, though elements of both were certainly present, but rather a complex portrait of a modern military machine straining against its own material limits. The Wehrmacht was, in many ways, a modern army. It had tanks, aircraft, motorized divisions, and incorporated advanced tactical and strategic concepts that were genuinely innovative for their time. Yet simultaneously, it was yoked to an agricultural, pre-industrial supply system that its commanders consciously chose to employ because modern alternatives were simply beyond their reach. They did the mathematics differently than we might expect. For them, in their circumstances, with their constraints and their assumptions about how quickly the war would be won, the mathematics said, use the horses, use them abundantly, use them until they break, and then requisition more. The Eastern Front demanded something that the Western campaigns had never required at such a scale: endurance beyond machinery. By 1943, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the logistical chains that had seemed adequate for France became hopelessly fragile. The rail networks the Germans inherited or built operated on a different gauge than German locomotives, a deliberate Soviet choice, you might imagine, to complicate any invasion. So converting those lines, laying new track, maintaining what existed, it consumed resources that could have been spent elsewhere. And in the meantime, supplies had to move by truck, by cart, by horse. Picture the winter landscape of Ukraine and southern Russia. The roads, if you could call them roads, dissolved into mud and ice in turn. German trucks, designed for European highways and relatively brief supply runs, would bog down or freeze. Spare parts became scarce. Fuel was always scarce on the Eastern Front, had to be rationed in a way that made long-distance supply movement a gamble. The horse, by contrast, asked only for fodder, and while the Soviet Union was vast and largely barren, there were farms, there were captured Soviet grain stores, there were grasslands. What emerged, gradually and then with increasing urgency, was something that historians sometimes call the Wehrmacht's horse army, though that phrase can mislead. It wasn't as though the Germans abandoned trucks and marched on horseback like a cavalry force. Rather, they layered logistics. Trucks moved supplies to depot points closer to the front. From those depots, wagons drawn by horses moved supplies forward in smaller increments. The horses themselves became part of the supply equation. They could be eaten. They could pull through mud that vehicles couldn't navigate. They didn't break down. They didn't need synthetic fuel. By 1943, The estimate was that something like 750,000 horses were serving in Wehrmacht supply trains across all theatres, but concentrated heaviest in the east. Some historians suggest the number reached closer to 1 million at certain points. Think about that. 1 million animals, each requiring several kilograms of fodder daily, each needing water, each liable to disease, exhaustion, or capture. And yet, they were cheaper in industrial capacity than trucks. A horse didn't require a factory that could be bombed by the RAF. The system created a different kind of vulnerability, though. Horses couldn't move supplies as quickly as trucks. A mechanized supply column could cover 100 kilometers in a day in good conditions. A horse column might manage 30. When the front moved rapidly, as it did in the early months of Operation Barbarossa, or as it did in retreat, the slower-moving horse-drawn supply train became a bottleneck, a liability. Commanders pushing forward couldn't wait for the wagons, and when units had to retreat, abandoning those horses, the loss was immediate and irreplaceable. There's a peculiar human dimension to this that often escapes notice in military histories. The men driving those wagons, the men responsible for the horses, the farriers and veterinarians attached to supply units, they witnessed something almost medieval unfolding. Here was 1943, 1944, and armies were still dependent on animal power in ways that hadn't been true in Western Europe since the Napoleonic Wars. The psychological impact on soldiers accustomed to thinking of themselves as part of a modern, mechanized war machine must have been strange. Are you advancing history or retreating through it? Am I part of a new war or an old one? The horse columns also represented a kind of administrative complexity that has, until recently, been underappreciated. Supply officers had to account not just for ammunition and rations, but for oats, hay, straw for bedding, medications for horses, replacement animals, harnesses, farrier tools. The Wehrmacht had to maintain breeding facilities, remount stations, veterinary hospitals. They captured horses in occupied territories and trained them to German procedures, which themselves differed from those of other armies. A Soviet horse or a Polish horse had to be retrained, a process that took time and resources. Some animals simply couldn't adapt. And in Russia, in the depths of a Soviet winter, the losses were staggering. Horses that survived the summer campaign, that had proven themselves reliable, died of cold, of disease, of starvation, when fodder supplies ran short. The mortality rate for horses in the Wehrmacht's eastern campaigns reached catastrophic levels in some units. Some sources suggest that by the winter of 1942-43, the Wehrmacht was losing more horses weekly than it could replace, even with active procurement and capture from Soviet territories. This wasn't a minor logistical setback. This was a system beginning to fail. Yet it didn't fail completely, not for years. And that's perhaps the most illuminating part of the story, the sheer inertia of military systems, the way a solution that makes sense at one moment continues to be used even when its effectiveness wanes. The Germans invested in horses because they made sense given their constraints. And by the time it was clear they no longer made sense, by the time trucks should have replaced them entirely, the resources to make that transition simply didn't exist. The factories were being bombed, the oil situation was deteriorating. The labor force that would have been needed to manufacture and maintain a fully mechanized supply network was deployed to the front or was no longer available. So the horses remained. They plodded forward through mud and snow, through advances and retreats, through victories and defeats, until the very end. They were part of the Wehrmacht supply system, because the Wehrmacht couldn't imagine surviving without them, not in the space and scale of the Eastern Front, not with the constraints imposed by geography, climate, enemy action, and industrial capacity. In some sense, they were the invisible machinery of an army that everyone wanted to believe was entirely modern. By late 1942, the Wehrmacht's supply crisis had begun to crystallize into something far more tangible than strategic miscalculation. It had become a matter of daily survival on two vast fronts, and the mechanisms designed to sustain an army were groaning under the weight of their own contradictions. The very railways that had carried German troops so swiftly across France and into the Soviet interior now represented both lifeline and albatross, stretching across thousands of kilometers, in a landscape where winter meant not merely cold, but the effective paralysis of movement itself. The question that haunted every quartermaster's office in Berlin was deceptively simple. How do you keep millions of men fed, armed, and mobile across the largest theatre of war in human history, when your industrial capacity, while formidable, simply cannot match the exponential demands of consumption? The answer, paradoxically, had already been decided long before anyone asked the question properly. Germany had committed to a war of attrition without securing the material means to sustain it. And when the mathematics of logistics became impossible, institutions turned to the familiar. They turned to what they know. They turned to what works cheaply. They turned to horses. Consider the peculiar rationality of the supply officer in late 1942. Rail capacity remained the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics, and yet each kilometer of rail extended meant more track to maintain, more personnel to guard against partisans and saboteurs, more locomotives burning precious fuel to haul supplies across the steppes. These were not abstract problems. In the Russian theatre, a single locomotive might consume as much fuel in a week of operations as a motorized battalion could use in sustained combat. The arithmetic was relentless. And beneath that arithmetic lay another layer, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The German High Command had never truly believed the Russian railways would fall under their control as smoothly as French railways had. They had expected quick victory. They had not expected to inherit a landscape of gauge differences, destroyed infrastructure, and the immense logistical tale of occupying a territory larger than Western Europe itself. It was within this calculus that the horse reasserted its ancient claim on military necessity. A horse requires no synthetic fuel. It eats grain and hay, and while the occupation had indeed disrupted agricultural production across vast swathes of Soviet territory, the Wehrmacht could still purchase, requisition, or seize fodder more readily than it could manufacture aviation gasoline or diesel oil. More than this, a horse integrated seamlessly with existing German military culture and doctrine. The Wehrmacht officer corps had been trained in an era when cavalry still meant something. Prussia, Austria-Hungary, the great empires that Germany's military traditions descended from, these had all fielded mounted units. Horses were not foreign to German military thinking. They were a regression, perhaps, but a regression to something tactically understood and organizationally mapped. By the middle of 1942, approximately 750,000 horses were in Wehrmacht service across all theaters. By 1943, that number would climb toward 1 million, and by the final year of the war, the Wehrmacht would have acquired or maintained roughly 2.75 million horses across its entire operational scope. Think for a moment on the scale of that number. It exceeds the active personnel strength of most modern developed nations' military forces. To feed 1 million horses requires roughly 4,000 tons of fodder per day. That is, in itself, a supply problem of staggering complexity. And yet, paradoxically, it was cheaper, in terms of industrial resources and energy expenditure, to feed those horses than to maintain the same transport capacity through mechanical means. The documentation that survives from this period reveals something almost poignant. Army veterinary services operating in the Russian cold, treating diseases that killed horses by the thousands. Glanders, a bacterial infection that decimates horses and is communicable to humans, ravaged herds wintering in improvised stables. Exhaustion and starvation followed, particularly as the supply lines themselves began to fracture under partisan action and the expanding scope of the Soviet counteroffensives. General Adolf Strauss, who commanded Wehrmacht transport, issued increasingly desperate orders, attempting to regulate the consumption of horse fodder. But these orders existed in the realm of wishful thinking. On the ground, horses were dying, soldiers were eating horse meat to stay alive, and the supply problem, rather than being solved, was simply being deferred, absorbed, metabolized by the organic matter of the animals themselves. What deserves particular consideration is the psychology of this choice. The Wehrmacht High Command was not ignorant. They understood, at some level, that employing mounted units against Soviet armor was not merely inefficient, but quasi-suicidal. German generals of the period, whatever their other failings, were educated men versed in modern warfare. They knew that mounted cavalry had become obsolete in the age of machine guns and artillery. And yet they persisted. Why? The answer lay not in tactical optimism but in logistical desperation, masked by institutional inertia. If you cannot manufacture enough trucks, if your fuel consumption cannot sustain your transport network, and if the alternative is paralysis, then you employ what remains to you. You employ horses because the choice has already been made by circumstance. The horses themselves came from everywhere. The Wehrmacht had initiated massive acquisition programs in Romania, Hungary, and occupied territories. Polish horses, known for their hardiness, were conscripted by the hundreds of thousands. Soviet horses, captured or seized from collective farms, entered the Wehrmacht stables. Italian horses served in subordinate roles. The animals became a form of currency, a measure of a unit's readiness, a desperate gamble that muscle and hay could substitute for the oil and steel that Germany could no longer procure in sufficient quantity. And beneath this logic lay a historical truth worth contemplating as you drift deeper into the architecture of this story. Empires often solve their contemporary crises by reaching backward into their past. They do so not out of nostalgia, but because the past contains solutions that are available when present solutions have become impossible. The supply trains stretching back from the Russian front became strange hybrid formations, trucks and automobiles to be sure, but interspersed with wagon after wagon drawn by horses, moving supplies forward at the pace of walking animals. Can you imagine the scene? A German colonel standing in a frozen railway yard, watching horses being unloaded from transports, knowing that these animals represented both a solution and an admission of defeat. The tactical implications were subtle but inescapable. Units with significant horse transport became tethered to roads and fixed routes. They lost mobility. They could not maneuver at speed, and as the Soviet Union rebuilt its capacity and began to execute increasingly sophisticated operational encirclements, the very immobility that came from reliance on horse transport meant that entire German formations found themselves surrounded, their supply lines cut, their only remaining option retreat or capitulation. The winter of 1942-43 tested the system to its breaking point. In the Don Basin, in the retreat from Stalingrad, horse-drawn transport collapsed. Animals froze. Fodder could not reach them. Soldiers consumed the flesh of their own supply animals to survive. The supply officer's nightmare became indistinguishable from the infantryman's hell. And yet, from the ashes of that catastrophe, the Wehrmacht did what it always did. It reorganized, recalculated, and recommitted. New horses were acquired. New fodder depots were established. The system that had failed was not abandoned but reformed, because the alternative was to admit that modern industrial warfare could not be waged with the resource base available to Germany. And that admission was, to the Nazi state, more unthinkable than any material shortage. And so the Wehrmacht found itself caught between two impossible demands. On one side stood the mechanized doctrine that had won them France in 6 weeks, a vision of armored columns racing across open ground, of motor transport moving supplies at speeds that cavalry could never match. On the other side stood the reality of the Eastern Front, where distances stretched beyond anything the German army had encountered before, where the supply lines grew longer with every kilometer advanced, and where the industrial capacity to replace vehicles simply did not exist. The tension between these two visions created what might be called a permanent state of compromise, or perhaps more accurately, a slow descent into desperation disguised as pragmatism. By 1942, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, the German High Command faced a choice that would ripple through the entire remainder of the war. They could either commit to a truly motorized army, which would require resources they did not have, or they could accept that large portions of their supply system would remain dependent on animal transport. In the end, they chose neither and both simultaneously, creating a hybrid logistical nightmare that would characterize every campaign thereafter. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A panzer division required enormous amounts of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. A single tank company of 5 Panzer IVs might consume 500 liters of fuel per day in active operations. Multiply that across an entire army group, and you arrive at millions of liters needed weekly. The trucks that existed could carry some of this, but there were never enough trucks. There were never enough trucks because German industry was producing tanks and weapons at an accelerating rate, and those same factories could not simultaneously produce unlimited vehicles for supply purposes. What happened instead was a gradual acceptance of horses as force multipliers in a system that was fundamentally inadequate. The Wehrmacht had not set out to fight a modern industrial war with medieval transport. It had simply discovered, through the hard lessons of the Russian campaign, that this was the only way to continue fighting at all. By 1943, something had shifted in how the German army conceptualized the problem. No longer were horses seen as a temporary expedient or a sign of backwardness. Instead, they became part of an explicit system, one that was documented, standardized, and integrated into supply planning as a legitimate component of military logistics. This represented a kind of acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that the war would be won or lost, not by the speed of their panzers, but by the capacity of their supply lines to sustain them. The development of standard horse transport companies created a new kind of unit, one that was neither entirely military nor entirely civilian, but rather a hybrid organization that drew on conscripts, older men unsuitable for combat, and specialists in animal husbandry. These companies were organized with remarkable consistency throughout the Wehrmacht. A typical transport company consisted of about 200 horses, divided into squads, each with its own handlers, veterinarians, and logistics personnel. The horses themselves came from Hungary, Romania, Poland, and the occupied territories, sometimes requisitioned, sometimes purchased, often both. What becomes clear when examining the detailed records of these operations is that the German army understood the requirements of horse transport with genuine sophistication. They knew how much feed a horse required daily in different seasons and climates. They understood the spacing of rest days, the importance of proper veterinary care, the relationship between hoof condition and operational capability. If anything, the Wehrmacht developed a more systematic approach to animal transport than many European armies of the period, precisely because they had no choice but to make it work. There was an almost bitter irony in this efficiency. Germany, a nation that prided itself on technological advancement, that had pioneered the tank, that possessed some of the finest engineers in Europe, was forced to become experts in the management of horse transport on a scale not seen since the Napoleonic Wars. The contradiction between the image and the reality was never lost on observers, then or now. Here was the Wehrmacht, marching across the Soviet Union with its gleaming panzers and advanced artillery, dependent for survival on the same beasts of burden that had carried supplies for Alexander the Great. And yet, reflecting on this from a distance, what stands out is not so much the contradiction as the sheer resourcefulness it demanded. The supply officers who managed these operations were not primitive or backward. They were military professionals confronted with a logistical problem of unprecedented scale and adapting with the tools available to them. The fact that those tools included horses does not diminish the ingenuity required to organize and sustain millions of animals across an entire continent in active warfare. As the war progressed into 1943 and 1944, as the Wehrmacht fought not only the Soviets but also began to face pressure from the West, the role of horse transport became even more critical. The mobility that mechanization had promised remained elusive, not because of poor planning, but because the fundamental constraints had never gone away. There were simply too many divisions, covering too much ground, over too great a distance, with too few vehicles. The horses filled the gap, day after day, in snow, rain, and mud, carrying supplies to front lines that stretched across an entire continent. The relationship between man and animal became, in a strange way, the hidden story of the entire Eastern Front. Behind every panzer advance lay hundreds of horses moving supplies forward. Behind every hold-the-line order lay horse-drawn ammunition wagons struggling through terrain that would have bogged down even the most robust motor vehicles. The panzers were the visible face of German military power, but the horses were the nervous system that kept them functioning. Without one, the other could not exist. Together, they formed a strange and ultimately unsustainable partnership, a marriage of the medieval and the modern that would characterize the entire Second World War on the Eastern Front. And so the machinery of logistics ground forward, perpetually incomplete, always reaching, never quite arriving at the sufficiency that modern warfare demanded. By the middle years of the conflict, when the Wehrmacht had already committed itself to simultaneous theaters across an almost incomprehensibly vast geography, the horse had become not merely a transport animal, but a kind of confession. A confession written in hoofprints across Eastern European mud, in the exhausted breath of beasts that had never been bred for such industrial-scale warfare, in the daily choice to use what could be found rather than what ought to have been manufactured. The Eastern Front presented a landscape that no logistician in Berlin had truly anticipated in its full, crushing dimension. The railways that ran eastward from Germany terminated or fractured far short of where the fighting actually occurred. The roads, where they existed at all, became impassable during the autumn rains, what the soldiers called the Rasputitsa, a phenomenon so profound that entire operations would grind to a halt, not from enemy action, but from the sheer inability of wheels to turn, of engines to advance through liquefied earth. In such conditions, what moved? Horses. The medieval became the modern necessity. A horse, for all its limitations, asked only for forage that might be gathered locally, required no manufactured fuel, and could pick its way across terrain that would consume a truck in minutes. By 1942 and into 1943, the German supply service was operating with somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 horses distributed across the Eastern Front. Some historians suggest the number climbed higher still, though the records, like so much from that time, carry the fog of incomplete accounting and the fog of intentional concealment. Consider the scale of that presence. That was not a peripheral asset. That was not a vestigial relic of a previous century. That was the skeleton upon which the spine of German military advancement actually rested. And yet it remains one of the least examined aspects of the war, overshadowed by the mythology of panzer divisions and Luftwaffe fighters. by the romance of mechanization that was never truly complete. The mortality rate among these horses was staggering. On the Eastern Front, in particular, the animals faced not merely the ordinary hardships of military service, but the extraordinary brutality of a theatre where temperatures could plummet to 30 or 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. The feed situation was dire. The animals were supposed to be sustained on forage gathered or requisitioned from conquered territories, but those territories became increasingly scorched by retreating armies and resisting populations. Horses grew emaciated. Their hooves suffered terribly in the mud and ice. They were worked until they collapsed, and then they were often left where they fell because there was no fuel, no time, no capacity to remove them. What became of a dead horse in such circumstances? In many cases, soldiers would butcher them for meat. The Wehrmacht even issued guidelines for this, creating a grim bureaucratic framework around the necessity of cannibalizing one's own transport. It was not something celebrated or widely advertised, but it happened with sufficient regularity that supply officers were forced to account for it, to calculate the caloric return against the loss of transport capacity. A horse represented perhaps 800 kilograms of meat. For starving men, this was not an abstract ledger entry but a question of survival. The recruiting of these horses, the sourcing of them, itself became an increasingly desperate endeavor. In the early years of the war, Germany had been able to draw on reserves that had been built up during peacetime, on breeding programs, and the agricultural infrastructure of Germany proper. But as the war continued, as losses accumulated and the front expanded, the Wehrmacht turned to requisitions from occupied territories. Horses were taken from Poland, from France, from the Soviet Union itself after conquest. This created a secondary effect, one that rippled through occupied societies. The seizure of horses was not merely a military action, but an agricultural catastrophe for civilian populations. Farmers lost the animals they needed for harvest, for transport, for their own survival through coming winters. In this way, the German supply system became not just a military apparatus, but an instrument of coercive extraction, drawing resources from those under occupation to sustain the occupation itself. By 1943 and 1944, the situation had become almost surreal in its contradictions. Germany was deploying cutting-edge tanks and mechanized formations, yet at the same time was deeply dependent on logistics chains that relied on animals that could not be replaced at any meaningful rate. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had invested far more heavily in mechanized transport from the beginning of the war, though it too relied on vast numbers of horses, particularly in supply operations. But there was a difference in scale and in intention. The Soviets, while they did not have unlimited mechanization, had not built their strategy around it in the way Germany had promised itself it would. The gap between German ambition and German capacity was precisely where the horse lived, waiting in the mud, asking only for grain that was not there. What does it mean, then, to contemplate a modern industrial war fought, in significant measure, by animals? There is something almost hypnotic about the contradiction, something that seems to resist easy categorization into the neat narratives we construct about the 20th century. We think of mechanization as inevitable, as the natural unfolding of technological progress. Yet here was one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth, at the height of its power and ambition, unable to sustain its vision without recourse to creatures that had drawn chariots in ancient Egypt, that had carried knights to Agincourt, that had turned the wheels of agriculture for millennia. The horse did not represent a failure exactly, or rather, it represented many failures at once, failures of planning, of resource allocation, of the gap between industrial capacity and ambition, of the sheer scale of what the war demanded compared to what any nation could reasonably produce. And as you drift deeper into the contemplation of these paradoxes, of horses moving through mud across a continent in flames, carrying the weight of ambitions they could not possibly understand, there is perhaps a kind of peace to be found in the thought that history is never quite as simple, as purely mechanical as we initially suppose. The grand narratives obscure the ordinary, the material, the almost forgotten presence of living creatures caught in the machinery of great events. The horses are still there, if you listen closely to the historical record, still present in the mud and snow, in the careful bureaucratic notations of supply officers struggling to account for the unaccountable, still asking their simple question, what will sustain us through this endless, impossible journey? The deeper one ventures into the logistical records of the Wehrmacht, the more apparent it becomes that the crisis of supply was not simply a matter of distance or industrial capacity, but rather a cascade of decisions made in the early years of expansion, decisions that seemed rational in their moment, but calcified into strategic vulnerability. By 1942, the German army had already become dependent on a supply chain that was fundamentally at odds with the very speed and mechanization it claimed to represent. The paradox was this: Hitler's generals envisioned a war of rapid maneuver, of blitzkrieg, of cities falling in weeks rather than months. Yet the moment those campaigns began to slow, the moment they encountered determined resistance that refused to collapse, the entire system revealed its hidden brittleness. Consider the nature of mechanized warfare as it was understood in that era. A panzer division could move perhaps 30 or 40 kilometers in a day across open terrain, consuming fuel at a rate that demanded constant replenishment. An armored column, once committed to an offensive, required not merely ammunition and food, but spare parts, oil, coolant, and replacement vehicles to rotate through maintenance. These were the unspoken costs of blitzkrieg, the supplies that existed behind the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire, the slow, grinding logistics that made the spectacular possible. Yet the German Quartermaster Corps, the men tasked with calculating these needs and moving mountains of material forward, found themselves perpetually outmatched by the distance they were required to cover. The Russian campaign, in particular, laid bare every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about supply and mobility. The vast distances of the Soviet Union, distances so immense that even mechanized transport struggled to comprehend them, meant that every kilometer eastward was a kilometer further from the industrial heartland of Germany. Supply lines stretched not across hundreds of kilometers, but thousands. Trucks that should have been carrying ammunition found themselves hauling fuel. Fuel stocks that should have sustained offensive operations were consumed simply in the act of forward supply. The railway network that might have solved this problem was almost immediately revealed to be inadequate, and when the Red Army retreated, they systematically destroyed the rail infrastructure behind them, a tactic that forced the Germans to either rebuild or rely even more heavily on trucks and, by extension, horses. What made this situation particularly acute was the fundamental asymmetry between the two armies. The Soviet Union, despite its horrific casualties and the loss of vast territorial extent, could afford to lose equipment because it could replace it. American industrial production was already ramping up by 1942, and supplies were flowing into the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease agreements. The Germans, by contrast, were dependent on what they could produce domestically and what they could scavenge from conquered territories. The French industrial base, absorbed into the German economic sphere, was never fully integrated into German production in the way the Nazis had hoped. The Italian economy was struggling. The Austrian and Czech industries were working at or near capacity. There was no vast reserve of untapped production waiting to be unleashed. And so, in the face of these mounting supply pressures, the Wehrmacht turned to solutions that were, in a certain sense, entirely rational within the constraints they faced. Horses required no petroleum. They consumed forage, which could be harvested from the land itself or from designated supply depots. Horses could move over terrain that trucks could not navigate. A horse could survive on grass in summer and hay in winter. A horse did not require the same level of maintenance as a diesel engine in sub-zero temperatures. When supply convoys were stretching across hundreds of kilometers, when railways were being repaired even as they were being destroyed, when fuel was becoming scarcer and mechanical failures were mounting, the horse began to seem less like a relic of a previous era and more like a practical solution to an intractable problem. By 1943, the German army was using horses more extensively than ever before, not because of nostalgia or because the High Command preferred the tactics of the Napoleonic era, but because the logistical mathematics demanded it. The Wehrmacht's animal transport strength had not declined, it had grown. Hundreds of thousands of horses were requisitioned not just from Germany, but from occupied France, Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Veterinary services were established. Remount depots were created. Feeding stations were scattered across the landscape of occupied Europe. In a very real sense, the German army had become a vast horse-consuming engine, moving food and fodder forward, even as it tried to move soldiers and ammunition in the same direction. This was the nature of modern warfare, conducted with pre-industrial transport. It required an enormous logistical tail. Every horse needed to eat. Every horse needed rest. Every horse required a handler, a wagon, a spare set of harnesses. A division that relied on horses for supply transport required more supply to feed those horses than it would have required in fuel for a fully mechanized division. It was a vicious circle, endlessly multiplying the burden, yet there was no escape from it. The choice was not between horses and trucks. The choice was between using horses or leaving supply stations unmanned, leaving armies without ammunition, leaving soldiers hungry in the frozen wilderness of Russia. The supply crisis also had another, more insidious dimension that is often overlooked in discussions of German logistics. The Wehrmacht's reliance on captured equipment and supplies meant that its operational capabilities were always somewhat fragmented. A division equipped with French tanks used French ammunition, French spare parts, and French fuel specifications. When that division encountered losses, replacements had to come from other captured stocks or be manufactured in occupied factories. This heterogeneity, while flexible in the short term, became a nightmare for logistics planners in the medium and long term. By contrast, the Soviet army, despite its massive losses, maintained a degree of standardization that, while brutal in its simplicity, allowed for rapid resupply and relatively straightforward logistics. The food situation was equally fraught with difficulty. The German army in Russia consumed vast quantities of rations, roughly 1 kilogram of food per soldier per day, plus fodder for the horses, plus supplemental food for the horses when fresh forage was not available. The conquered territories of the Soviet Union, despite their enormous agricultural potential, were largely stripped of surplus grain during their occupation, either consumed by the occupying forces or held in storage for transport back to Germany. The result was a perpetual shortage of food supplies, a shortage that was masked, to some extent, by systematic plunder but never truly resolved. By the winter of 1942 and 1943, as the Sixth Army encircled itself at Stalingrad and other armies began their long retreat westward, the food situation became desperate. Soldiers received reduced rations, horses starved in the snow, supply depots ran short. Yet the generals and logisticians continued. They had no choice. Once committed to an offensive of such vast scale, stopping was not an option. The only path forward was to continue pressing, to continue trying to break through, to continue hoping that somehow, through speed or tactical brilliance or sheer will, they could achieve victory before the supply chain finally snapped completely. It was a gamble conducted on a continental scale, with millions of lives at stake, with horses freezing to death in the Russian winter, with men eating the flesh of the pack animals when food ran out. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horses in the Second World War was not a sign of primitiveness or backward thinking. It was the inevitable result of a war that had been conceived as short and decisive, but which had become long and grinding. A war whose supply requirements grew exponentially with each passing month, while the capacity to meet those requirements remained stubbornly fixed. The horse, in all its patient endurance, had become not merely a beast of burden, but something far more delicate, a living measure of a logistics system reaching toward its inevitable breaking point. By 1943, as the Wehrmacht stretched across the vast Russian steppes, the mathematics of animal transport had grown almost dreamlike in their impossibility. Consider that a single cavalry division required somewhere in the region of 4,000 horses for its basic operations, and that across the entire Eastern Front, the German army was attempting to maintain upward of 700,000 equines in conditions that grew progressively harsher with each passing month. The sheer arithmetic of feeding these creatures alone, each horse consuming roughly 20 to 30 kilograms of forage daily, created a logistical demand that rippled backward through every link in the supply chain. The Quartermaster Corps found themselves caught in an intricate knot of their own making. Horses, unlike trucks, could not run on synthetic fuel derived from coal tar distillation, and they could not be repaired in a workshop if their legs went lame from frostbite. They existed in a state of permanent biological vulnerability that no amount of German engineering ingenuity could overcome, and yet they had become indispensable precisely because of this vulnerable truth. No mechanical alternative existed in sufficient quantity. It is worth pausing here to consider what this reveals about the actual state of German industrial capacity, even at what is often imagined as the height of Nazi technological supremacy. The myth of the all-mechanized Wehrmacht was always, in many ways, a comfortable fiction. What made the situation increasingly precarious was the manner in which horse losses accumulated. In the summer months, disease, equine plague, glanders, and a host of lesser afflictions would sweep through cavalry and transport units with devastating speed. A few horses falling ill in one corral could, within days, affect an entire division's ability to move supplies forward. Then came the Russian winter, that merciless crucible that German soldiers had written about in letters home with an almost helpless awe. The cold did not discriminate. A horse that had weathered one winter in adequate shelter might perish in the second, its reserves of strength finally exhausted. Frostbite would claim animals that had survived bullets and bombs. The winter of 1942 to 1943, particularly around Stalingrad and in the southern sector, became what some historians have called a catastrophe of attrition that went far beyond human casualties, though those were themselves apocalyptic. The replacement system for horses was, quite remarkably, still operating on methods that had been refined during the Napoleonic era. Captured horses from conquered territories, Polish stock, Ukrainian animals, even some Soviet cavalry mounts, were incorporated into German service, but the process of breaking and training them consumed months of time that the military machine did not possess. There is something almost poignant in imagining the process. Young cavalry soldiers, perhaps themselves only recently inducted into the Wehrmacht, tasked with gentling frightened foreign horses into service. These animals would have carried different saddles, responded to different commands, possessed different instincts shaped by different landscapes. Yet into this framework they had to be forced. Meanwhile, the question of food for the horses became entangled with the question of food for German soldiers themselves. When winter came, when local supplies were exhausted, when the rail lines to the rear became increasingly subject to partisan attack and Soviet bombardment, commanders faced an almost unbearable choice. Horses could eat straw, hay, and dried grasses that humans could not digest, but they could also be slaughtered for meat when conditions grew desperate enough. There is historical evidence that in certain isolated units, particularly during the terrible winter of 1942 and 1943, horses were consumed by the men they were meant to serve, not always as a calculated decision made by supply officers, but sometimes out of raw, immediate necessity. One can hear in the recorded testimonies and letters a kind of bitter resignation, a soldier acknowledging in understated language that the horse had given its final service to the Wehrmacht. The mechanization of the German military, when one examines the supply lines rather than the propaganda, reveals itself as incomplete and in many crucial ways illusory. Trucks broke down. Trucks required fuel that was never in sufficient quantity. Trucks could not navigate roads that had been transformed into rivers of mud by the spring thaw or the autumn rains. The horse, by contrast, asked only for forage and rest, and it could move through terrain where vehicles would be hopelessly bogged down. This is perhaps why, despite the immense technological advantages that Germany possessed in other domains, the Wehrmacht continued to rely on mounted transport even as the war progressed deeper into its middle years. It was not a choice made from nostalgia or military romanticism, but from the austere logic of available resources. Yet there remained a psychological dimension to the relationship between soldier and horse that deserves gentle acknowledgement. Reading accounts from the period, one encounters repeated references to soldiers' attachment to their mounts. A horse that had carried a rider through dozens of engagements, that had survived countless nights in the snow, had accumulated a kind of existential weight within the mind of that soldier. In a war increasingly characterized by mechanization and distance, by the removal of consequence from the act of killing, the horse represented a direct, intimate form of transport. The soldier felt the horse's warmth in winter. He knew the animal's temperament and could predict its responses. There developed a bond that transcended mere utility, though of course utility remained its foundation. When a beloved horse was lost, to enemy fire, to disease, to simple exhaustion, soldiers often recorded the event with an emotion that seemed disproportionate to the loss of mere equipment, yet somehow entirely understandable to anyone who has cared for an animal in difficult circumstances. The tragedy of the horse in the Wehrmacht was, in many ways, the tragedy of the Wehrmacht itself, a military machine that, for all its discipline and tactical brilliance, was perpetually at odds with the material conditions it sought to command. The horse was a living symbol of this contradiction, impossibly useful, impossibly fragile, consuming resources while simultaneously enabling the consumption of greater resources through its labor. As the war ground onward into its third and fourth years, as the initial conquest of the Soviet Union gave way to brutal stalemate, the simple fact of millions of horses needing millions of tons of forage annually became an invisible but immovable problem. It did not kill Germany, not directly, but it represented a kind of deep structure constraint on German power that all the genius of the General Staff could not quite overcome. The photographs from 1943 and 1944 tell us something that statistics alone cannot. They show soldiers in felt caps and wool greatcoats standing beside horse-drawn carts laden with ammunition, with snow falling around them, with vast stretches of white steppe visible behind them. One might pause and ask, how did the most technologically advanced military force in continental Europe find itself, by the middle of the war, more dependent on animal transport than it had been at the beginning? And the answer, it turns out, lies not in any single failure of planning, but in a cascade of choices, constraints, and consequences that accumulated across 3 years of unrelenting demands on the Eastern Front. By 1943, the Wehrmacht's horse population had begun to stabilize at somewhere around 750,000 animals. This number itself is almost incomprehensible, when you consider that it represented a commitment comparable in resources to maintaining hundreds of thousands of motor vehicles, except that horses required a fundamentally different kind of infrastructure altogether. They needed grain, they needed hay, they needed stabling or at least shelter from the elements, and they needed constant care from farriers, veterinarians, and trained handlers. The Reich could not simply produce horses the way it produced trucks. The breeding programs that Germany maintained could not expand fast enough to replace losses, which meant that throughout 1943 and 1944, the Wehrmacht increasingly turned to purchasing horses from occupied territories, from allied nations like Romania and Hungary, and even from conquered lands in the east, where the logistics of acquisition were chaotic and unreliable. Consider the nature of the Eastern Front itself during these years. By 1943, Operation Barbarossa was no longer an advance. The German army was defending, then retreating, then defending again. The supply lines that had been established in the first years of the campaign were now fragmenting. The distances between supply depots and frontline units were expanding in some sectors and contracting in others, as the front lines themselves became fluid and unpredictable. The roads that had been rudimentary to begin with were now damaged by the constant passage of vehicles, animals, and troops, and the Soviet winter turned them into impassable mud during the autumn and spring months, periods that the soldiers called the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, when literally nothing moved except on foot or by animal power. A horse, you see, could navigate terrain that no truck could cross. A horse did not require petrol, which was increasingly scarce. A horse did not need to be repaired by specialists with specialized parts. And so by 1943, the paradox had become this. Germany was investing more heavily in animal transport than it had in 1941, even as its technological position should have been more secure. The reasons for this are layered, and understanding them means understanding something about the nature of industrial war itself. The German motor pool had indeed expanded since 1939. The Reichswehr had produced and captured thousands of vehicles. But these vehicles consumed fuel at a prodigious rate. The Wehrmacht's entire logistics network was built around the assumption that Germany would achieve a quick victory in the Soviet Union, securing vast oil fields in the Caucasus and thereby solving its chronic fuel shortage. When that victory did not materialize, when the German army found itself bogged down in a prolonged conflict covering thousands of kilometers, the fuel situation became catastrophic. By 1943, synthetic fuel production in Germany itself, while growing, could not meet the demands of the military, the civilian economy, and the industries that were attempting to rearm the nation for a longer war. The Luftwaffe was burning through fuel at a rate that began to exceed the capacity of the entire German synthetic fuel industry. Every liter of fuel allocated to trucks was fuel not available for tanks, for aircraft, for the mechanized formations that were supposed to be the Wehrmacht's primary advantage. This was the mathematics of total war, and it was ruthlessly simple. If you could move supplies and equipment by horse, you conserved fuel for the engines of war that could not be powered by animal muscle. And so, as paradoxical as it sounds, as Germany's position became more difficult and its access to resources more restricted, the solution was not to further mechanize the supply system, but to demechanize significant portions of it, to retreat, in some senses, toward a mode of logistics that had been perfected over centuries. It was not a failure of imagination. It was a rational response to an irrational situation, a country fighting a continental war with insufficient oil, insufficient manufacturing capacity to replace losses, and an enemy that grew stronger with each passing month. The men who operated this system were aware of its limitations, and many recorded their frustrations. The Quartermaster Corps of the Wehrmacht had to plan each campaign knowing that they could not rely on rapid supply delivery. Divisions moving through the eastern territories had to establish their own supply lines almost as they advanced, and they had to maintain the local infrastructure, the grain stores, the stables, the roads themselves. This meant that occupation forces were never purely military in character. They were also logistical organisms, constantly extracting resources from the civilian population and the conquered territories to feed themselves and to maintain the equipment upon which they depended. The economic relationship between the occupied territories and the German war machine was therefore direct and immediate in a way that it was not in Western Europe. The grain harvests of Ukraine became critical to the survival of the German army. The horses of Poland and Romania became essential components of the military machine. The railway infrastructure of Russia became a prize worth fighting for, because without it, supply by truck or animal became even more difficult. As 1943 progressed and the defeats began to accumulate, Stalingrad at the beginning of the year, the Kursk salient in the summer, the retreat across the Dnieper in the autumn, the supply situation became more precarious still. The territories that Germany had relied upon for horses, for grain, for forage, began to slip from German control. The Soviet army, advancing westward, was recapturing lands that had been feeding the German war machine. The Wehrmacht found itself stretched across longer and longer lines of communication, defending against an enemy that was becoming numerically superior and increasingly well supplied by American Lend-Lease shipments. The horses that the Germans had captured or purchased had to be fed, but the forage that fed them was becoming harder to source. The cycle of logistics was beginning to break down, slowly at first, then more rapidly. And yet still, the horses remained. Through 1944, through the months following the invasion of Normandy, through the final desperate battles in the east and west, the Wehrmacht continued to maintain its cavalry divisions and mounted units, continued to haul artillery and supplies across muddy roads and through forests and across fields. Some of this was inertia, perhaps. Some of it was the absence of any viable alternative. Some of it was simply that the organization was too vast, too complex, to be rapidly transformed. But much of it was understanding, whether conscious or unconscious, that this was the only way the war could continue at all. The moment the horses were gone would be the moment the Wehrmacht's ability to wage war had fundamentally collapsed. The mathematics of supply, once understood in this profound way, began to reshape the entire German command structure by the middle years of the war. Officers who had trained in the precision of calculation, the neat columns of transport schedules and depot inventories, found themselves staring at equations that would never balance. There were simply not enough trucks. There were not enough trains running at full capacity. And so the decision that had seemed almost practical in those earlier years, to use horses where fuel and vehicles could not reach, became instead a kind of architectural foundation upon which the entire Eastern Front would rest, creaking and uncertain. By 1943, the German army on the Eastern Front employed somewhere in the region of 750,000 horses. Some historians place the figure higher. The records were themselves fragmentary, scattered across quartermaster reports and divisional requisitions that were sometimes lost or never properly compiled. But the consensus among those who have studied the archival material with care is that on the Russian steppes, the Wehrmacht had become the largest cavalry force in continuous operation since the Napoleonic Wars. It is a statistic that carries within it an almost surreal weight. Here was the nation that had pioneered blitzkrieg, that had engineered the dive bomber and the tank, that had imagined a future of mechanical warfare. And yet that same nation was dependent upon the horse, an animal whose relationship to human warfare stretched back 1,000 years or more. The reasons for this paradox deserve careful attention, because they reveal something about the nature of industrial capacity under total war. Germany had simply not manufactured enough trucks before or even during the opening campaigns. The Wehrmacht's planners, in those confident months before Operation Barbarossa, had calculated that the war in the East would be won in a matter of months, perhaps 4 or 5 at most. Why, then, manufacture vast quantities of vehicles for a campaign that would conclude before winter? The assumption had been that Soviet vehicles could be captured, repurposed, and integrated into German supply lines. Soviet trucks, so the reasoning went, would help sustain the advance deeper into Russia. But the Soviet Union, in its own desperation and determination, had moved much of its industrial base eastward, beyond the Urals, beyond easy reach. Many of the captured trucks that fell into German hands were damaged beyond repair or could not be maintained because spare parts were unavailable. And those vehicles that could be used needed fuel that was itself in short supply, particularly as the war extended beyond those first summer months and as Allied bombing campaigns began their slow, methodical work against German refineries and fuel production facilities. So the horse came to fill the gap. The horse asked for oats and hay, commodities that could be foraged, could be grown, could be seized from the conquered territories themselves. A horse did not require specialized parts manufactured in German factories. A horse could survive on grass and water when depots ran low. In a strange and terrible calculus, the horse became the rational choice, the pragmatic solution to an unsolvable problem. Yet it was pragmatism that locked Germany into a strategy that could not possibly succeed across such vast distances and such brutal conditions. The Russian landscape, with its deep mud, the Rasputitsa, the soldiers called it, turned roads into rivers of mire each spring and autumn. Trucks became immobilized. Horses, their hooves finding purchase where wheels spun uselessly, became the only reliable transport over ground that seemed almost to reject the machinery of modern warfare. And so, across the immensity of the Eastern Front, from the frozen north near Leningrad to the steppes before Moscow and beyond, the image of the Wehrmacht became something that no propaganda poster had ever truly captured. A modern army, moving on horseback, leading supply wagons drawn by animals that might have marched alongside Napoleon's Grand Army itself. The maintenance of these hundreds of thousands of horses represented a logistical burden that few outside the supply services fully appreciated. Horses required veterinary care. They required farriers, those skilled craftsmen who could shoe a horse properly, who could treat infections and injuries. They became vulnerable to disease. In the harsh Russian winter, despite efforts to provide shelter and care, horses died in numbers that strained the replacement system. Germany found itself needing to acquire remount horses constantly, sourcing them from occupation zones, from allied nations, from territories that could spare them. This requirement, in turn, created additional supply lines, additional labor, additional complexity in an already overwhelmed system. What emerges from this historical moment is something that invites reflection on the nature of technological advantage itself. Germany possessed superior tanks, more sophisticated tactics, and a military tradition of remarkable innovation. And yet, in the final measure, it found itself dependent upon the horse, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The more industrial power a modern state devotes to armored warfare, to mechanization, to the technology of destruction, the more fragile that state becomes if that industrial production cannot meet the demands of conquest on such a scale. Germany discovered too late, if it discovered it at all, that an empire cannot be sustained by tanks alone. The rhythm of supply along the Eastern Front, then, became a rhythm that oscillated between mechanical and animal power, between the future that Germany had imagined and the past it could not escape. Supply officers woke in the cold mornings of the Russian winter, knowing that thousands of horses needed food, that trucks needed fuel, that neither would arrive in sufficient quantities, and that their commanders would ask anyway. What began as a practical compromise had become, over time, a kind of symbol. Visible proof that even the most modern armies, when stretched across continents, when tasked with conquest and occupation on a scale that exceeded all reasonable capacity, would find themselves returning to solutions that belonged to earlier centuries. By the spring of 1943, the Wehrmacht's logistical crisis had moved beyond theoretical concern into lived, grinding reality across every theatre of operation. The vast distances that had seemed manageable in the initial momentum of invasion, those sweeping advances through Poland, into the Soviet Union, across North Africa, had calcified into something far more punishing. Supply lines that stretched backward for hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 kilometers, now carried not abundance but rationing, substitution, and the constant, aching question of whether the next convoy would arrive before the next crisis. The horse, in this context, had become something more than a romantic relic or a symbol of pastoral Europe. It represented an admission that the Reich's industrial capacity, for all its vaunted prowess, could not sustain the appetites of a mechanized war across continental distances. And yet, and this is perhaps the quieter paradox, the horse remained indispensable precisely because it required almost nothing that the war effort desperately needed elsewhere. It consumed fodder, yes, but fodder grew in the conquered territories. It needed no refined petroleum products. It produced no toxic fumes in the frozen air that might alert enemy reconnaissance. It could navigate roads that had become little more than mud tracks during the Rasputitsa, those seasonal thaws that turned the Eastern Front's landscape into something almost biblical in its desolation. What becomes clearer as we trace through the administrative records and supply manifests of 1943 and beyond is that the Wehrmacht wasn't simply clinging to horses out of tradition or inability to modernize. Rather, a peculiar equilibrium had formed. One might even call it a kind of exhausted pragmatism. The motor pools were being reserved for combat operations, for the rapid movement of panzers and motorized infantry, for the vehicles that could actually influence the course of battles. The horses, meanwhile, carried the bread, the ammunition, the winter clothing, the wounded. They were the vascular system that kept the extremities alive, while the steel muscles did the work of conquest. By this stage of the war, the supply departments had developed something approaching a science around horse utilization. A typical Wehrmacht cavalry division required roughly 12 to 14,000 horses, depending on its specific configuration. An infantry division, supposedly the modern core of the German army, relied on somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000. These weren't ornamental numbers. They were calculated almost to the individual animal, factoring in replacement rates, forage requirements, veterinary capacity, and the grim statistical reality that on the Russian front, horses died. They died from cold, from artillery fire, from disease, from simple exhaustion. The mortality rate in winter could exceed 30 or even 40% of a unit's strength. This meant that the Wehrmacht's remount system, the apparatus for replacing dead and injured animals, had become as crucial to operational capability as ammunition factories or tank repair shops. Entire sections of the Quartermaster Corps existed simply to source, train, and distribute replacement horses. And here we encounter one of the stranger footnotes of the war. The Reich relied heavily on horses captured from conquered territories. Polish horses, Soviet horses, even Romanian and Hungarian stock were pressed into German service. The Army's acquisition officers developed expertise in assessing equine quality, understanding bloodlines, recognizing which breeds would survive on reduced rations. It was a grim kind of knowledge, applied with the same methodical efficiency the Wehrmacht brought to every other aspect of organization. But there was another dimension to this reliance, something almost existential. As fuel shortages deepened, and they deepened continuously from 1943 onward. The question wasn't merely whether horses could supplement motorized transport. Rather, horses became the alternative to immobility. In some sectors of the Eastern Front by 1944, entire units found themselves essentially immobilized because fuel allocations had been redirected to more critical operations. The horses, in those instances, meant the difference between a functioning supply line and total paralysis. They meant that food could still reach forward positions, that wounded could still be evacuated, that some semblance of operational continuity could be maintained. The rhythm of the war, as it progressed deeper into these middle years, was increasingly shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the horses' capacity to endure them. Winter became the period when German operations in the east would contract, not merely because of snow and ice affecting human soldiers, but because the logistical load on the horse transportation system became almost unmanageable. Summer brought renewed campaigns because the roads hardened and forage became more available. It's a peculiar thought that the timing of major offensives, the schedules of strategic initiatives, were governed not just by Hitler's ambitions or by the perceived vulnerability of the enemy, but by the biological and nutritional requirements of thousands upon thousands of horses. And perhaps this reveals something deeper about the nature of industrial warfare that hadn't yet fully matured. The nations and militaries of the 20th century were attempting to wage conquest at a scale that had never been attempted before, across spaces so vast, with logistical burdens so immense, that even the most advanced industrialized power discovered gaps that only older, pre-industrial solutions could fill. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horses wasn't a failure of modernity. It was, paradoxically, a consequence of pursuing modern warfare beyond the limits that even modern industrial capacity could sustain. The horse wasn't dragging Germany backward. It was, in a sense, the price of their attempt to reach forward. The paradox deepened as the war itself transformed. By 1942, the Wehrmacht supply crisis was no longer a matter of planning oversight or industrial miscalculation. It had become something far more intrinsic to the machine itself. The very speed and ambition of German conquest had outpaced the infrastructure that might have supported it. Think on this for a moment. An army designed to move quickly and strike decisively across European plains found itself suddenly responsible for feeding, clothing, and maintaining millions of soldiers across territories stretching from France to the gates of Moscow. The logistical apparatus that had seemed so clever in concept simply could not scale to that reality. What emerged was a kind of adaptive desperation. The supply services, the quartermaster corps, and the administrative organs beneath them began to rely more heavily on what historians sometimes call living off the land, a euphemism for systematic extraction of resources from occupied territories. Rather than shipping grain from the Reich itself, supply officers requisitioned food from France, from Poland, from Ukraine. This solved one problem and created another. It meant German civilians at home were not starved for the war effort, but it also meant that subjugated populations bore the direct burden of feeding the Wehrmacht. It was efficient in a cold accounting sense. It was also morally catastrophic, and it created resentment and resistance in every place where soldiers appeared with their clipboards and their quotas. The Eastern Front made all of this exponentially worse. When the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June of 1941, German planners had assumed a quick victory, perhaps 6 weeks, perhaps 12. The plan was predicated on defeating the Red Army rapidly, and once that was done, German supply lines would consolidate, shorten and stabilize. Victory would solve the logistics problem. But the Soviets did not capitulate on schedule. The Red Army, despite catastrophic early losses, continued to fight. The distances involved were almost incomprehensible to Western European minds accustomed to wars fought across hundreds of kilometers. The Eastern Front sprawled across thousands. A supply truck from the Reich to the front lines might travel for weeks, and the further east the Wehrmacht pushed, the longer those supply lines became, the more horses were needed to haul supplies when trucks broke down or fuel ran short, and the more tenuous the entire system grew. Consider the peculiar vulnerability of the horse as a supply animal in extreme cold. The Eastern European winter came early and arrived with ferocity. Horses, no matter how hardy the breed, required shelter, fodder, and consistent care. In the brutal winter of 1941 to 1942, when temperatures dropped far below zero and the ground froze solid, Wehrmacht horses died by the tens of thousands. Some estimates suggest that more than half the horses committed to the Russian campaign did not survive that first winter. They froze in their harnesses. They starved because grain was frozen solid and could not be thawed. They succumbed to diseases that spread rapidly through weakened herds, crowded together for warmth in inadequate shelters. And as the horses died, the supply system lost capacity, precisely when the demands on it were most extreme. The irony, and it was a bitter, grinding irony, was that the Wehrmacht had been forced to import more horses to compensate. If 200,000 horses died in the winter, 200,000 more had to be procured, transported, and integrated into the system. This created its own logistical nightmare. Where were these replacement animals to come from? Germany itself had limited resources, but Poland had horses. Conquered territories had horses. The Wehrmacht's supply services began requisitioning animals from across occupied Europe with increasing urgency. It was a kind of vicious spiral. The more the Eastern Campaign overextended itself, the more horses it consumed, and the more horses it had to steal from subjugated populations. By 1943, the proportion of Wehrmacht supply transport that depended on horse-drawn vehicles had actually increased, not decreased, despite all the technological advancement Germany had achieved. This was not through choice, it was through necessity. The fuel situation had become critical. As the war consumed more and more petroleum products, as the Allies began bombing German synthetic fuel facilities and Romanian oil fields, trucks that had once been abundant became scarce. Fuel that had been allocated to supply convoys was diverted to combat vehicles. Horse transport became not a relic of an earlier age, but a necessary adaptation to resource scarcity. The Wehrmacht was indeed fighting a modern industrial war with horses, but it was doing so not out of tradition or stubbornness, though those elements were present, but because the industrial system itself was failing to deliver the resources necessary to sustain modern warfare at the scale and intensity at which it was being waged. What did this mean for the soldiers in the field? The man in the trench, the panzer crew, the infantryman trudging through mud and snow. What was his experience of this supply crisis? He felt it constantly. His rations, once adequate, began to shrink. The bread became darker, more heavily cut with sawdust or chestnuts, less nourishing. His clothing, designed for European campaigns, proved inadequate for Russian winters. Replacement uniforms arrived late or not at all. Ammunition, the lifeblood of combat, became subject to rationing in some sectors. Vehicles broke down and remained broken for weeks, while spare parts worked their way through the distribution system. Medical supplies were often insufficient. In one sense, the supply system was doing its job. The Wehrmacht remained a functioning fighting force, even as it stretched across vast territories with a logistics network held together by luck, improvisation, and horse-drawn wagons. But soldiers knew they were being asked to do more with less, and that knowledge eroded morale almost as surely as combat did. The horse thus became, in a very real sense, the measure of German desperation. Each additional animal hitched to a supply wagon represented a failure somewhere else in the system, a truck not available, a fuel shortage, an industrial target lost to bombing. And yet without that horse, the entire apparatus would have collapsed faster than it did. The machine that was the Wehrmacht, the carefully organized, scientifically managed military force that had conquered most of Europe in a matter of months, depended fundamentally on an animal whose ancestors had been carrying supplies across European roads for millennia. In that dependence lay a profound truth about the nature of industrial war, about the difference between having the capacity to plan total conflict and having the capacity to sustain it across time and space and distance. When we consider the full arc of this history, what emerges is not a story of simple failure or incompetence, but rather the collision between two fundamentally different understandings of what modern warfare could be. The Wehrmacht's reliance on the horse was not a relic of the past clinging to tradition, though that played its part. It was, in many ways, an unavoidable adaptation to the reality of attempting to sustain a continental empire with resources that could never quite match the ambition of the vision that drove the war itself. In the quietness of this realization, there is something almost melancholic to contemplate, the way that even the most rigidly planned systems, even those built on ideology and industrial coordination, find themselves bent and twisted by the friction of actual terrain, actual distance, actual necessity. The horses that carried supplies across Russia were not failures of imagination or technology. They were, perhaps, honest acknowledgements of limitation. 6 million of them, moving across frozen ground and through mud that swallowed wheels and tracks alike, served as a kind of silent testimony to the gap between intention and capacity. In their way, they were as much a part of modern warfare as the tanks that preceded them or the aircraft that flew overhead. The war was not won or lost because of the presence or absence of horses, but the presence of those animals tells us something essential about what it cost to even attempt such a conquest. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from reading the supply reports, from understanding the mathematics of it all. The quartermaster corps, those logisticians and planners who lived in the realm of numbers and procedures, faced a puzzle that could never quite be solved. Every ton of grain diverted to feed horses was a ton not moving ammunition forward. Every hour spent processing veterinary requests was an hour not spent on ammunition distribution. Yet the alternative was paralysis. This is the paradox that haunted the entire enterprise, and in some sense haunted every military command that has ever attempted to sustain an invasion at such a scale. The story of the Wehrmacht supply system is, at its heart, a story about the hidden architecture of war. We see the tanks and the marching columns, we read about the great battles and the turning points, but the actual substance of conflict, the real substance of it was grain sacks and forage orders, was the careful rationing of captured resources and the desperate improvisation when those resources proved insufficient. It was the hooves of horses pressing into mud, carrying the materials that kept soldiers moving forward, deeper into territory that would eventually turn and consume them all. As the years pass, and this history recedes further into time, what might we take from it? Perhaps it is the understanding that in war, as in many human endeavors, the constraints we face are often more powerful than the grand strategies we devise. The Wehrmacht could not simply will itself to have unlimited resources. It could not imagine away the distances of Eastern Europe or the winters of Russia through force of ideology or industrial capacity. What it could do, and did do, was adapt. The horses were that adaptation. They were humble, unglamorous, and in the final accounting, insufficient. But they were also real, a concrete expression of the lengths to which an institution will go when pressed by circumstance. The men who managed these systems, the officers who submitted their requisition forms and calculated their rations, the enlisted men who cared for the animals and moved the supplies forward, they were all caught in the same web of necessity. They were, in a sense, as bound to the logic of that system as the horses themselves. The war demanded endless forward motion, and forward motion required logistics, and logistics required horses, and horses required food, and food had to come from somewhere. Always from somewhere that could never quite provide enough. It was a chain of dependencies stretching across an entire continent. And when the weather turned, and the supplies faltered, and the armies began to fall back, that chain grew tighter and tighter until it finally broke entirely. There is a quiet lesson in this, perhaps, about the nature of ambition and planning. The most meticulously organized systems will encounter the unmeasured resistance of reality. The most carefully calculated logistics will face the implacable arithmetic of distance and time. And when they do, when that moment of friction arrives, all that can be done is to persist, to adapt, to find what resources remain and use them as best one can. The Wehrmacht did this with a kind of desperate ingenuity, and that ingenuity bought it years of war. Bought it nothing but years of war, in the end, but years nonetheless. Consider the quiet exhaustion of it all. The supply lines extending thousands of kilometers, the depots scattered across a conquered continent, the animals moving endlessly forward, replacing those that failed, feeding those who remained. The paperwork accumulating in offices in Berlin and Prague and Warsaw, the reports flowing back about shortages and damages and losses, all of it a kind of elaborate machinery designed to push forward, to consume and advance and dominate, moving ever deeper into territories that would ultimately refuse to be dominated. In the final analysis, the story of Wehrmacht Supply is the story of a system that functioned, that somehow managed to sustain one of the largest military campaigns ever attempted, and yet a system that was never quite sufficient. It was always one crisis away from complete breakdown. There were always shortfalls, always compromises, always the need to make do with what was available rather than what was needed. The horses bore witness to this fundamental insufficiency. They were the visible manifestation of the gap between ambition and capacity. And yet, there is perhaps a kind of strange nobility in the attempt itself, even as we recognize its ultimate futility. To sustain an army of millions across such distances, to keep it fed and armed and moving, was an extraordinary feat of organization and will. That it ultimately failed does not erase the fact of what was accomplished in the attempt. The logistics worked, in a sense. It was only war itself that did not work, that could not work, not in the way it was imagined and planned. As we think on this quiet history, this unglamorous history of movement and supply, and the patient animals that made it possible, we might ask ourselves what we learn from it. What does it tell us about the nature of planning and preparation, about the collision between grand vision and material reality, about the patient machinery of logistics that underlies all human endeavor, not only in war, but in the building of empires, the construction of civilizations, the simple act of keeping a complex system moving forward through time? The answers, like so much of this history, are quiet and subtle, requiring us to sit with the discomfort of their incompleteness. There are no final lessons here, only the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from paying careful attention to how things actually work, to the humble realities beneath the dramatic narratives. And in that attention, in that willingness to see past the surface to the intricate mechanisms beneath, perhaps we find the most valuable kind of knowledge, the knowledge that prepares us not for certainty, but for the inevitable confrontation with complexity. The horses have long since turned to dust. The supply lines have dissolved into history. The men who managed them are gone, their problems solved only by the passage of time. Yet the questions they faced remain relevant, echoing forward across the decades. Questions about how we sustain our ambitions, how we manage our resources, how we adapt when reality refuses to conform to our plans. These are questions that will continue to matter as long as human beings attempt to organize themselves into large systems and move